Leaves of 3. After the night I just had, I do not know whether I should call the cops, roll up in a ball and cry myself to sleep, or call my therapist. I am still trying to decide the best course of action. I already talked to my friend Kyle, and we agreed to some preliminary steps. But first I should tell you the full story. When I was in my teens, my friends and I would frequent a local park named Eigelhart to play basketball and swim at the indoor pool. There was also an expansive nature preserve that we would explore. Days and evenings spent there remain vivid to me, as your formative years tend to hold those memories tighter in your subconscious. We would play basketball for hours, then take a nice long walk through the trails, which could go up to 10 miles in whichever direction you chose. The indoor pool closed indefinitely for some reason I don't remember now. But I had many a birthday party there through the years. As we got older and became more interested in girls, this would become a spot for secluded private activities as well. Every town has its lover's lane, and this was that for us during high school. We had a large group of friends, but my closest ones were Kyle and Bailey. We were inseparable, and often you could catch us together if we weren't at work or class. We dubbed ourselves the 3 Leaves, and made a stupid handshake. All because we saw a sign in the nature preserve that warned of poison ivy with the ominous statement, "Leaves of 3? Let it be." After years of exploring the nature trails, we had found a lot of cool things simply forgotten to the world by time. Lots of very old signs from decades prior. Rock and wood seating, grown over with the local flora. Hidden pathways obstructed so much with fallen limbs and trees that it was hard to tell where the trails ended and untamed wilderness began. I can't tell you how many times we got lost by accidentally walking into the Greater North Woods, which holds a small 20-mile section designated as the Nature Preserve. Each adventure we always seemed to find something interesting, some new place or relic from the past. It all came to an end the summer going into senior year, when Bailey went missing. Being as we spent every day together, Kyle and I wondered why we hadn't heard from him in a few days. We went over to his mom's house, and while she definitely loved her son very much, she was used to him not coming home. So, by the time the police got involved, Bailey had already been missing for 3 days. We checked all the spots we could think of. There was even a small search in the North Woods, but everything was called off after a few weeks. Apparently, it was thought that he left town to do door-to-door sales for High Times magazine. He had done this in the past, but his experience was so terrible and frightening that I would have never thought he'd go back to it. I told the police as much, but I was just a kid in high school, and they knew better. I'm not so sure anymore. Kyle and I remained close and still are 5 years later. With this brief backstory in mind, I want to try and explain what happened to me over the past few hours in the North Woods. The day started like any other. I woke up and checked some work emails before brewing myself a cup of coffee while I took a quick shower. I'm glad that I stuck out college because while I'm not using my degree, it did open doors for me at the entry level into other fields, which can hopefully translate into better opportunities later down the road. Before heading out, I was scrolling social media and saw a memory of Bailey, Kyle, and myself at some party. This brought back some fond as well as sad memories, and I decided that after work I was going to go on a nice walk at Eigelhart Park and toke one in remembrance of a good friend. The weather was supposed to be perfect, and it had been a while since I had been back there. I had the thought to call up Kyle and see if he wanted to tag along. But then I realized he was doing his monthly stream-a-thon for his channel. I thought maybe I'd hop on and watch the stream later and let him know. Work was work, and after I clocked out, I stopped at the gas station to get a few energy drinks before making my way to Eigelhart Park. While I live in a moderately sized city, there are plenty of country roads and backwoods, and that's near enough where the park is located. It's only a 20-minute drive to get back into city limits. But you can feel the isolation when you're there. You would think you were truly alone with nature. As I pulled into the parking lot, I had this sense come over me and it put me into a reflective mood. A lot had happened in life since being a teenager. Not a care in the world walking these trails. I sparked one up outside the car in homage to a lost friend. Gazing at the trees swaying with the breeze, the sound of birds being scared off suddenly jerked me out of my reverie. And, finishing up my smoke, I decided to start my trek. From the parking lot, I stopped at the derelict, abandoned indoor pool building. I had many fond memories there, although I was always too scared to jump off the high dive. I wondered why it even shut down, as I remember it was quite popular back in the day. But as the thought came to me, something else caught my attention. I thought for certain I had heard someone say something, but I couldn't tell what it was. It almost sounded casual in tone, but it was cut off abruptly. I looked around for a few minutes before deciding it must have just been the wind. I noted that there were no other cars here, so that must have been the case. After leaving the pool behind, I passed the basketball and tennis courts before coming to the main entrance to the nature trails. Walking up to the trailhead, I realized that not much had seemed to change about the place in the years since it'd been there last. The entry walkway was still made up of rocks instead of the packed dirt that comprises the rest of the official trails. Off to the left, there was still that rickety wooden observation platform, now showing several more signs of rock than what I could recollect. Straight ahead, I could see where the trail splits into three, taking you along different routes that would lead into other trail middles or beginnings. I didn't mention before, but there are multiple exits to the nature preserve. Whether those are official or not, who's to say? But I can tell you that after years exploring, there were a total of 3 ways to get into the preserve. I think at some point in the distant past when this area was being developed, it was clear where to go, if you were to hike up the grassy hill that runs alongside the basketball courts. There was a second entrance. There is a large, flat rock and a sign just inside the woods, but from the outside you wouldn't be able to tell there was. Maybe a 10-minute walk from this exit, there is a trail that opens up into a clearing and a short waterfall from the stream that runs through some of the park. On the opposite side of the preserve, there is a third entrance that I believe was most likely made by kids like us. I say that because it came out into a youth baseball field. With no signage of any kind. In our teens, we would regularly walk all over this place, so we ended up knowing it very well with all this in mind. There are all kinds of great places to visit if one has the time. But being as I came here after work, I knew I'd only be able to explore the woods for a couple hours at most. It probably would take that whole time if I were to try and do the whole lap. So instead I started off down the left of the 3-trail split. For your average person never stepping foot here, this is the trail I recommend. At least I would normally. It has the most scenic views, with wooden bridges to cross the small stream that runs through. There are also several rows of long classroom-style benches carved out of gigantic fallen trees. There's even a sign detailing the creation. I decided to sit down on one of the benches and got out my phone to check in on Kyle's stream. This area isn't too far from the entrance, and there were 2 paths you could take to go further, or you could just turn back around. I sat on the bench for some time, remembering our high school days. Days more like it. These very seats held so many memories. I got my first tongue kiss here from Aubrey Clark, and more later. We had concerts with our stereos, smoke sessions with the boys. We bore witness to and participated in many fights, be it playful or serious in nature. There were a few instances of the cops coming out, but I think it wasn't a popular place to go, so we weren't bothered by them too often. This was the one gravel area in the whole place, so we made youthful use of it. Of course, Kyle was having a blast gaming on stream, and I saw that he was only 13 subs away from his next goal. So I gifted 15 subs with a smirk. You know how streamers will thank whoever gifts subs? Well, it's always funny as hell seeing your buddy do it, especially with my moniker Duncan McCockiner. As he read it off with appreciation, it hit him. The look on his face brought me out of my near reverie and I busted out laughing. He knew who it was by now and had a laugh with his chat. I stayed on for a few minutes and we had a bit of small talk until I brought up where I was. His expression grew solemn and he's a classy enough guy to not tell the chat our backstory of this place. Apart from the locker room talk about our wild, semi-true feats, we agreed to come back here again next week when he has some more free time. Now that I was in a bit of a happier mood, I swung myself off the bench and headed off again. The trail I chose this time lead down Honeysuckle Hollow. All the trails have names, but I have forgotten most of them. This one always stuck out to me due to the alliteration. It's also a trail connector of sorts, as it splits into 3 and you can take those eventually back to the starting points or exits. But if you take this one all the way to its natural end, you come out to a huge wooden deck that overhangs part of the forest. And you get a really good view of nature. That was where I planned to go. As this is at the deepest point of the preserve, I planned to take one of the unremarkable paths back to the car. Unfortunately, this trip was anything but unremarkable. I was walking down the hollow trail towards my destination when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had the sudden sense that I was being watched. I've seen many animals here, including coyotes, but this felt different. I took a few minutes to survey the landscape and became satisfied that I was just being a scaredy cat. Sunset was still an hour away at least, so I didn't think I had much to worry about as long as I got out of the woods before then. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I found the wooden deck at the end of the trail. This one seemed to be in much better condition than the one at the entrance. So I happily took a seat and checked my phone. I didn't realize I had left the stream up, so my battery was low. I became a little annoyed at my carelessness, then stood up and leaned against the railing, looking over at the untamed forest. I was a little lost in thought, slowly spiraling into a depressive state when faced with the nostalgia here. At some point as I gazed all around, down at the bottom of this overlook, it seemed that there was another trail, one that led to who knows where. My friends and I had never walked down there. Nothing that we knew of led into this trail. I was more than a little curious, and after a bit of searching, I saw only weeds and brambles. Looking closer, I could see along the left side of the deck while facing it there was a dirt path. It was overgrown by foliage, and looked like not much use was gone out of it. But I was excited to find this, and I couldn't wait to keep it a secret until Kyle and I came back out here the following week or whenever it would be. I had about 30 minutes before it would get dark out, so I made a mental note to not get too carried away exploring. I started off carefully, as it really is steep, and I was glad that it hadn't rained for a couple weeks so it was nice and dry. When I got to the bottom, I could see that it split going left and right. I decided to go left, as I had been all night so far. I wonder now if I went right if I'd still be alive. Almost immediately around the bend, I started seeing trash all over the ground. I became irritated that people can't clean up after themselves. The world is their trash can, etc. Walking a few hundred feet further was when I noticed that it wasn't all trash, but some discarded clothing as well, as I came upon one particularly dingy piece of cloth worn threadbare by time. I noticed it was the upper part of a torn-up shirt with the tag on the back. Someone had written their name on it, and when I read it, my blood ran cold. The name on the shirt was written as Michael. If you've made it this far, you might be asking what the significance of this was. I'll tell you. Bailey was one of my best friends in school and that was his last name. His first name was Michael. Furthermore, he was the absolute only person I knew who always wrote in capital letters. Even for class writing assignments, it was always capital letters. We never really gave him shit for it, but it was a fact. Nonetheless, I became super confused by what I was seeing. There's no way this was my friend's shirt. The cops supposedly searched the whole area. That's when I remembered how incompetent they were. How sure of their theory of a runaway. A mix of emotions swirled within me. Fighting for dominance, logic and curiosity won out. There could be any number of reasons this shirt got here, and it could simply be some kid who tossed their destroyed shirt away. It was still eerie, but I walked further along until I saw some kind of drainage ditch on the side of the path. It had a rocky riprap drop off to a culvert, maybe 15 feet down below. From here I could see many more discarded pieces of humanity, scattered at the bottom. I thought it odd, because this culvert probably eventually connected to that indoor pool that was abandoned. There should be nothing coming out of that drain other than water runoff. If that, as I peered down below, I heard the snapping of a twig. I spun around and tensed, every muscle taut, the hair on my arms and neck electric. I frantically looked all around me, trying to pinpoint the origin of the sound. Just when I felt myself relax, satisfied it was a squirrel or some such, I caught an image of something behind a tree, some 50 yards or so away. It was a face, a horrible face, one that looked like it belonged to one of those fucked up things from I Am Legend. I was paralyzed with fear, my sanity slowly slipping. I don't know if he knew I had seen it, but it hadn't moved. Yet I knew in the most primeval way that it was merely waiting for me to completely let my guard down and continue walking in that direction. I tried to calm myself and project aloofness. And I'm not sure if it worked or not, but the thing remained in place. I took another look at the culvert, trying to appear casual, then started back the way I came. At a brisk walk, I tried to keep my peripheral wary of whatever it was that was out here. But it was hard. When I reached the base of the path that would bring me back up to the wooden deck, I chanced to look. Right around the bend I saw two more of them climbing up from the rocky drain off. I scrambled up the steep incline and latched onto the wooden deck. Then heaved myself over. I began running as fast as I could down the path, not giving a shit which trail I was on or even paying much attention where they branched off. I had a vague sense in my panic-filled delirium that my car was in this general direction. And that's all that was moving me along. I heard the things further back, and knew they were following. At this point it was nearly dark, the sun shining its last few rays of daylight. Even if my phone was not nearly dead, I felt it would have been suicide to try and stop to call for help. I was in this alone. I kept running, choosing random trails as they appeared. I chanced to look back, and twisted my ankle, sprawling face first into the dirt and leaves. Grimacing in pain, I tried to get my bearings as I wrenched myself up onto my feet, balancing myself against a flat rock. Through my haggard breathing and short gasps of pain, I tried listening for more movement, but I couldn't hear anything. I then tried getting my bearings, looking for signs or markings that I could place. I realized that I was near the exit that was up on top of the hill past the basketball courts. Safety was seemingly within reach. I could walk down that hill straight to my car. I had a primal fear of this, however, because I was now limping and would not be able to run that distance. And in this way, I would be totally exposed out in the open. If those things were anywhere nearby, they would easily spot me. I cursed at myself for not paying attention during my flight. But all things considered, I wasn't dead yet. That was a plus. Yet, it seemed the safest way to stay out of sight would be to somehow get to the complete opposite end of the trails, where the main entrance was. From there it would be just a few minutes' walk to my car. But it was a big ask. As I pondered my options, I heard rustling behind me. Before I could react, something grabbed at my shirt collar and yanked me to the ground. One of those things looked down upon me, and I saw the hint of a malevolent grin. It tried to grab at me, but I scrambled back to my feet, and we stared each other down for a few seconds. Those seconds felt like eons, and I could finally get a good look at the thing. Truly, it seemed like a human, only with its skin almost melted down. My original description from earlier still seemed to hold up, only this time I felt more of an impression that this wasn't some supernatural being. It seemed a human being, somehow deformed. I heard more noise in the distance, and the thing took that as its opportunity to try and grab at my neck again. This time, I was ready. Since I got home, I've been silent, thanking my dad for pushing me to compete in wrestling all my life. I scooped up the thing in a fireman's carry and dumped it onto the rock headfirst. While not killing it, it was clearly unconscious, so I took the opportunity to scramble my way off the trails into the forest, hoping my general direction would take me close to the main entrance. It was now pitch black. I realized not even halfway there that I'd never make it out here if I kept this up. My suspicions were confirmed when up ahead I heard more branches breaking and leaves crunching. I spun around and knew I had to make a daring move. I limped along the best I could towards the clearing, and those things were gaining on me due to my injury. As I approached the waterfall, I could hear their heavy breathing right behind me, their grunting almost gleeful. I took one more look behind me and saw 4 of them slowly approaching. I took out my last energy drink, a tall boy, and launched it into the face of one that started towards me first. Then I did what I never could before. I jumped off the high dive. There was no way of knowing if this was suicide or not. I never knew how shallow the water at the bottom was. Fortunately for me, there was no rocks, so I plunged in and resurfaced, swimming with the current of the stream as fast as I could. It was also well that it appeared that none of them made the same leap. I couldn't turn around to see if they were still at the top of the clearing. But I had gained myself a small advantage because I knew this small waterway turns into a creek and winds a little farther down, which runs through the area I first reminisced at with the tree benches near the main entrance. I made it there unnoticed and gathered my strength. Now I just had to make it to my car. I hobbled along as silent as I could and couldn't hear anything from the forest around me. I was quite fearful still, as now I fully believed those things could be inhabiting all the north woods. The only sounds in the night were my own foot scraping the ground as I half-dragged half-walked on it. It made me very aware that I could be drawing them back to me with all this noise. But I finally made it back to the entrance and saw my car in the distance. I quietly and cautiously made my way, sticking to the shadows, ever fearful my presence would be noticed. I stopped at the wooden deck and gathered my energy and wits. There was a not-so-easy distance to travel to get to the car. But I heard nothing. I continued crouching and sneaking as best I could and hunkered down next to the derelict pool. This was it. I was not even 30 yards from my car. Yet the same feeling of being watched returned to me. I couldn't see shit, and my heart was still racing from the past couple of hours of this nightmare. Good thing I didn't need to see anything. Just here, there was a loud bang followed by more banging sounds. I could feel the vibration as well. It was coming from the abandoned indoor pool building. Was this where these freaks lived? As if in answer to my unspoken thought, I noticed some movement higher up the wall and saw a small window with several ghastly faces pressed up against it. I could see the malignant glee, the rabid lust in their expressions. I darted off as fast as I could towards the car. Despite the cacophony and fear, I made it inside my car. I chanced another look towards the building, backed away from it as I was. I could see that every window in the place was filled with those faces of terror. All seemed to be trying desperately to escape and capture me. I could almost see the building shake and quiver, as if their combined efforts could get through brick and steel. I didn't think they could get out of the windows either, because they were those small ones that were only maybe a couple feet wide. I sure as hell wasn't going to test that theory, or chance that any more of them were still lurking about. So I drove out of the park like a bat out of hell. It seemed that I hadn't breathed until my headlights illuminated the gas station. 20 minutes away from Iglehart Park, I drove past and continued on to my house. When I pulled in the driveway, I let out a huge sigh of relief and bawled my eyes out. I had made it. I got out of my car and immediately lit up a cigarette, trying in vain to calm my nerves. Then I called Kyle and tried my best to explain everything that had happened. He seemed disturbed, probably because I sounded insane, I thought. To my surprise, he seemed to listen and believe me. It was a big deal someone believed me, as I knew the cops wouldn't. We agreed that the shirt with Bailey's name on it was strange and maybe we could get the answers we desperately needed about his disappearance if we went searching ourselves. We made some plans to go back during daylight, armed somehow, preferably in the morning as to give us as much daylight as possible to work with. I know it sounds crazy after the night I've just had, but after seeing that shirt I realized how much I needed closure on this. S3 were best friends for nearly a decade, and Kyle feels the same way as I do. I'm going to finish wrapping my ankle. Turns out it's probably sprained. But I just heard something outside. My hairs just went up, because I just realized something. I didn't have to unlock my car when I was making my escape. I never checked my backseat. Grandpa's secret lived in the basement. It was during the spring break of my second year at college that I got a phone call from my Uncle Andrew, asking me if I'd be willing to spend a few days over at his house. My grandfather had been sick for a long, tough while, and it had apparently gotten to the stage that the primary focus now was less so to treat him and more so to just make him as comfortable as possible for the time he had left. I can't say I envied anyone in the situation. Grandpa, who'd be getting ready to face eternity in a house that wasn't his, with no company but a son who he barely spoke to these days. And Andrew, whose girlfriend died giving birth to their daughter 7 months ago and was now tasked with taking care of a dying man on top of that. I'd like to act as if I was making a saintly decision to come over and offer a helping hand out of love for my family. But the truth was that it had been quite some time since I'd spoken to Andrew last. And it had been forever since I'd spoken to my paternal grandfather. No, I went because I was lonely. Unbearably so. I didn't have any friends to speak of at college. And ever since my mother passed away about a year ago, I'd had no one to talk to at all. I made the decision to help Andrew out of the desperation for proper social interaction. Not like there'd be much to it. Anyway, All I really imagined I'd be doing is keeping the baby out of his hair when he was too busy and getting Grandpa anything he needed. Andrew's house was out in the sticks, at least 40 minutes away from the nearest town. My family are mostly dotted around a generally quite rural county, so there wasn't much in the area but barren roads and the odd building or two. As for the house itself, there wasn't really much to say about it from the front yard. Just another isolated double story that someone called home. I rang the doorbell, and after a few moments Andrew greeted me. He seemed more or less the same as the last time I'd seen him in the flesh. Nick, how are you doing? Thanks so much again for coming. He smiled, his voice nothing if not welcoming. No, not like I had much going on anyway, I replied, to which he chuckled. Come on in. Throw your jacket on the hanger there. You want some coffee? Sure, I said. Yeah, alright, have a seat over in the living room. First door to your left. I took his invitation and made my way over. Now that I was fully inside, I could see that there was more to Andrew's house than meets the eye at first. It smelled like old books and something faintly musty. The scent of time that slowly claimed everything. The entryway was wide and dimly lit, with heavy curtains blocking out the daylight. There was a quiet rhythm to the house, the creaking of wood beneath our feet. The soft shuffle of Andrew's footsteps echoing through long corridors. It had the basic interior of a house a lot older than you'd think it was from outside, with aged patterns across the wallpaper and a somewhat ornate type of miniature chandelier suspended from the ceiling. Clashing with these design decisions was the more minimalist furniture and art pieces hanging from the walls. It seemed like someone had taken these measures in order to give the inside of the building a more modern feel. But really, it was a band-aid on a bullet hole. I looked around after reaching my destination. The living room appeared comfortable enough, with an ever so slightly peeling couch, a worn rug, and shelves of books that didn't seem to have been touched in years. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, a bit musty, but lived in, as though the walls had absorbed the memories of countless years of family life. A minute or so later, Andrew entered with 2 mugs. I sipped mine slowly as we exchanged some admittedly uncomfortable small talk. God, you look so grown up. It's been, what, 2 years? It had been at least 5. This continued for a while until we got to the tasks that'd be at hand for the next number of days. I'll be picking him up from the hospice tomorrow after work. It'll probably be close to 7 before we'll be back. Chloe's upstairs having her nap right now, so I'm gonna go and get started on making dinner. In the meantime, you go ahead and make yourself comfortable. There are 2 rooms free upstairs. You can take your pick. He rose and clapped me on the shoulders before heading over to the kitchen. I really do appreciate it, Nick. It's been rough having to pay for babysitters. After going upstairs, I passed what must have been Andrew's room on the way down the hallway. Another chamber masquerading as belonging to a home far younger than was the reality. With a double bed and a child's cot next to it, the baby sleeping soundly inside. I had a mountain of college assignments to get cracking on, so I'd brought my laptop and sociology textbook in my travel bag. That's how I spent the majority of the evening. Taking an hour's break for dinner, we had another fairly awkward conversation about what I'd been getting up to in college. Spoilers. Fuck all. From my seat at the dining room table, I was able to look out the window at a filth-coated golden retriever pottering around the yard outside. I hadn't noticed it before. I was surprised that Andrew was able to manage a dog on top of his life as a single father. As I tried to focus on my pork chops, something else caught my eye. There was a door in the corner of the room that I hadn't noticed before. A small door, almost entirely hidden behind another old bookshelf. I couldn't see much of it, but there was something about the door that captured my attention. Something in the way the wood seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though it wasn't quite real. Is that a closet? I asked, pointing. Andrew looked over his shoulder and then shook her head quickly. Oh, that? No. Just a small little space in the structure I haven't really found a use for yet. He smiled, but it was tight, forced. I was going to ask him more before the dog outside started barking loudly. God, what's his problem? Andrew sighed, exasperated. Hey, you never mentioned you had a dog. Seems like an awful lot of work for you. I commented. Nah, he's not mine. Just some stray that's been finding the yard lately for whatever reason. The conversation petered off after that. But I remember thinking that if that was the case, it was odd that the dog had a collar. I called it a night maybe 2 hours later. But I had a hard time sleeping because the dog continued to bark periodically until all hours of the morning. In the morning, Andrew was already gone to work when I awoke. But he'd left instructions on the kitchen counter for taking care of Chloe. I'd babysitted before as a teenager, so I could manage things fine. But it never really gets any more enjoyable changing a diaper. Other than that, there's not much to say about the day other than that I'd tried checking out the door behind the bookshelf out of curiosity and boredom, but I'd found it locked. I didn't really care though, since it sounded like it was nothing more than just a small crawlspace or something. When Andrew arrived home, wheeling Grandpa with him, I could see for myself just how sick he must have been. He had stage 3 skin cancer that had by now spread through a terrible amount of the tissue in his torso. Andrew would tell me later on that night that he had 2 weeks left. Tops. The man looked like a skeleton. His complexion beyond wrinkled and pale. His head like a skull with its eyeballs left intact along with a few pointlessly added tufts of snow-white hair. His skin was hanging off of his body so loosely, as if the space between had been repeatedly filled with air and then deflated. I'd been hoping I could have at least some sort of conversation with him, since I'd seen him even less in my life than Andrew. But he could barely work a sentence together, mostly just murmuring, grunting and pointing at things to communicate. The evening ended up being even more uncomfortable than the last, so I spent even more time with the company of my schoolwork. Figuring Grandpa would probably prefer to be with his son anyway, especially seeing that as far as I knew, they hardly ever saw each other either. I ended up just going to bed early, Grandpa in the room next door. But of course I was kept up for ages by that stupid dog again. I ended up spending, I think, another week at Andrew's, and I'm not gonna recount every day from here on, since it ultimately doesn't really matter much to where I am now. Andrew had to keep going to work, of course, so it fell to me to keep watch of Chloe, and help Grandpa take his medicine. The only words that he could consistently get out, or perhaps the only ones he cared to, were his frequent complaints about the various pains in his body. The skin, my muscles, the flesh, I'd heard before. Not from my father but from my mother, about how Grandpa didn't treat him and Andrew very well. He was Vietnam vet, and the war came home with him, rearing its head in the form of a bottle and the abuse that resulted from it. Even in spite of that, I couldn't help but pity the pain he must have been experiencing for the last few months of his life. All I could do is keep encouraging him to choke down his pills. During the second night with Grandpa in the house, I was woken up yet again by the incessant barking of the dog outside. After the dog had seemingly fucked off to annoy someone else, I was quickly drifting back to sleep, until I heard Grandpa mumbling something next door. I'd gotten accustomed to his mostly nonsensical mutterings throughout the day, and the house had thin walls, so I didn't think too much of it, until I heard another voice, speaking back to him, Andrew's voice, whispering, just audible, "No, I've told you already, it's not happening, so get it out of your head. You know you have to," came Grandpa's slow response. His voice was like the creaking of an old floorboard, but he sounded far more lucid than I'd ever heard him before. I don't remember their conversation continuing beyond that point. I heard the door open softly, then shut again, and I didn't have enough energy to ponder what I'd heard for long before I fell back asleep. The next day, I decided to find out from Andrew about it in private. "Hey, so, sorry if I'm being too nosy here, but I heard you and Grandpa talking about something last night. It sounded like you were arguing?" I asked. He sighed deeply. "Look, you've probably realized by now that this house is a lot older than you might have expected. Truth is, it belonged to him. Your father and I grew up here. He's just, well, he's not happy with how I've been running things here. That's all. You know how older guys are really particular about that sort of thing." He looked conflicted about what he'd said, and the silence between us was deafening. "Come on, I just managed to get Chloe asleep 5 minutes ago. Let's get to bed for tonight." I can't say I was entirely satisfied with that answer, but I could sense Andrew didn't wish to discuss the matter any further. So I obliged him. On the bright side, there was no barking from the dog that night, or any of the following nights for that matter, so I slept well, at the very least. I don't have anything to say about the day after that, Other than that, the uncomfortable atmosphere in the house was only getting worse. Grandpa spent all of his time alone in his room, just sitting in his wheelchair in the corner, mumbling nonsense to himself, Andrew and I delivering his meals to him, giving him his pills, and sharing some unspoken weight about it all between us. That night, I was woken up by another argument in Grandpa's room. Grandpa's voice was no louder, no more commanding, but I could sense an undeniable rage in it. "You're a fool. You always were. I know what you did last night. You think that's enough? It has to be me. You don't deserve it. You treated us like dirt. It doesn't matter if I deserve it. It has to be me. And it has to be tomorrow." I didn't fall back to sleep quickly that time. Actually, I don't think I got any sleep that night. I didn't know what any of it meant. But Grandpa's words scared me. The following day, Grandpa's door was locked from the inside. Andrew also stayed home from work, and he looked terrible. I knew I had to ask him what happened last night, but I decided to give some space until the evening. I barely saw him all day. To be honest, the only perception I had of him was the tired cooing to Chloe every now and then. The unlocking and relocking of Grandpa's door as he took his pills every 3 hours. And a dinner we shared in silence. In the end, it was he who came to me. "You heard us last night, didn't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, I guess you deserve to know at least this much. I don't imagine your parents ever told you before they were gone." He looked like he was about to either scream or break down in tears. "I'm not sure which. Your father and I had a younger sister once. Phoebe. I was 8 when she was born. Your old man 11. My mind raced trying to fit this into my family history. He wasn't lying. I'd never heard so much as a word of this throughout my life. She went missing when she was 5. Just gone. Without a trace. They never found her. Dad started drinking a lot more after that. I didn't know what to say. That, tomorrow, Dad was talking about is the anniversary of the disappearance. I think the memories just hurt him the most today. They hurt me the worst today too." He was crying now. "I'm sorry. I managed. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. No one ever told me." Andrew rubbed his eyes, steeling himself. "Look, I'm sorry too. You should never have needed to know. Really." He started heading for the stairs. "I'm gonna try and get some sleep. Please, if you hear anything from him tonight, or if I have to come into him again, just ignore it, please. It hurts everyone enough as it is." With that, he headed up to his room, shutting the door behind him. I was stunned. How much else had I not known about my dad's side of the family? Even with what I did know now, I was left with more questions than before. It didn't make sense how the truth about my dad and uncle also having a sister could link to everything else I'd overheard between Grandpa and Andrew. Why did it have to be Grandpa? What had Andrew done last night? What the hell even was it? My mind swam as I laid wide awake in bed that night. I think it was that state of fog in my brain that actually ended up putting me unconscious for a few hours. As it happened, but one last time, I was awoken from my sleep. But it wasn't by the barking of a dog, or by voices from Grandpa's room next door. It was by slow, heavy footsteps, descending the stairs. I know Andrew told me to ignore anything I might hear that night. To this day, I don't know what compelled me to leave my room, but I crept out the door quietly, and the first thing I realized is that Grandpa's door was open, and his room empty. The footsteps continued to pound through the house, into the kitchen. It seemed, I had to know the truth to everything that was going on in this house. And I sensed that I was right at the cusp of it. As silently as I could, I too descended the stairs. I followed the noises to the kitchen, and I realized then what I'd been overlooking the whole time. The sight of it filling me with total dread. The door behind the bookshelf, now wide open. I abandoned whatever idea of stealth I had left in my head, rushing over to the door, where I found that it wasn't some sort of small little cupboard or crawl space at all. It was a flight of stairs, down to what must have been a cellar. Why had Andrew lied about this? I flew down the stairs and turned to the cellar door on my right, pressing my ear against it. Deep, heavy, fatigued breathing, and the surface of the door felt almost as if it was vibrating, pulsing with some impossible force. I gripped the door handle, and it felt white hot. My hand turns. The door opens. The truth is revealed. Andrew was alone in the cellar. illuminated by one dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The kitchen knife in hand. No sign of Grandpa anywhere. Andrew barely reacted to my presence. He just kept staring at the wall opposite of him. Only, it wasn't a wall. Not really. Where there should have been brick and wallpaper. A pulsating, oozing, red-brown expanse of flesh spanned the side of the cellar ahead of us. The dry wall at the edges of the adjacent walls transitioning from plaster and sheet brick into living tissue. The wall heaved, and throbbed, and sweat, somehow horrifically, impossibly given the gift of life. I can't even begin to describe the smell. The smell was so fucking disgusting. I could barely think. The sight of it almost made me feel mad. Like I had found myself in a bizarre nightmare. Any rational thoughts shackled away behind lock and key. What the fuck? I choked. What the fuck is this? Andrew, what the fuck is this? Where the fuck is Grandpa? He turned around, seemingly broken out of a trance. He stared back at the wall for a second. He was right, I heard him say, more to himself than to me. He turned back. He was right. It had to be done. I glanced back around him to the putrid fleshy mass before my eyes. No, he couldn't mean that. No. Andrew, where's Grandpa? What have you done? I begged, denying to myself what I knew had transpired. Andrew glanced back at the wall again for a few moments. He had a look of almost reverence etched across his face. He faced me for a second, madness twinkling in his eyes. It's what he wanted. No, you're lying. I roared, not believing myself one bit. What the fuck even is this? He didn't look away from the wall of flesh. I inherited it, I suppose. It had to be done. You know, it's what he wanted. The wall suddenly flexed outward grotesquely, emitting a low grumbling sound. Try as I did to deny it to myself in the moment. I knew what that must have meant, as I saw a look of concern flash across Andrew's face. It was hungry again, needed to be fed soon. Clearly, Grandpa wasn't a filling me. Amidst the grumbling, we could both suddenly hear a high-pitched noise, piercing through it. Chloe, crying from upstairs. Andrew stared up at the ceiling, then back over to me. Don't, I whispered, but he was already charging towards the door. Andrew, don't. He shoved hard against me as I tried to block him from getting out of the door. I threw myself against him with everything I had, tried to wrestle the knife from his grip, but he was far stronger than he looked, overpowering me quickly and slashing my right leg. I howled in shock and pain. You know what? He hissed, throwing me to the ground and grabbing me by my legs as I gushed blood. This is even better. You're of far more use anyway. I realized in an instant what he meant as he dragged me towards the wall of flesh. No, I choked. No, Andrew, please God, My words were cut off as I became almost entirely immersed in the writhing, living mass. Tendrils wrapped around me, almost painlessly puncturing through my skin, connecting to me. For a few brief, passing moments, I had the notion that I was linking, fusing to the grand, biological system of the wall. That soon all would be alive. All would be connected. Before my mind went black. After an unknowable length of time, I grew more and more aware of my surroundings once more. The bizarre, weightless sensation of simultaneously feeling out of my body and feeling one with another body. Then, something cold, foreign. I've got you. I've got you. I fell forward into someone's arms. The cold air of the cellar enveloping me in an instant as I screamed out. I looked up. I was surrounded by a team of men in yellow hazmat suits, working to fully cut me down from the wall of flesh. I laid in their arms, feeling the way I imagine a newborn infant must, my body and mind focusing entirely on trying not to seize up from how overwhelmingly cold everything seemed. A few minutes later, once I'd been fully freed from the wall, I was given sedatives that knocked me back out. I don't know how long I'd spent like that, but it must have been a few days at least. Because it was my girlfriend, Emily, who had called the police after I hadn't responded to a number of her calls. In the end, though, I was kept in some sort of containing facility for a day, where I was asked a great deal of dubious-sounding questions that I couldn't begin to answer for the most part. And they never ended up finding Andrew. In the end, though, Emily took me back home. Whatever classified part of the government that covers up shit like this did just that. And life mostly moved on. I tried my best to forget about that brief, hellish stint of my life. I certainly didn't gain any sort of enlightenment or newfound appreciation for life by my experience. I was changed by it. I guess. Who wouldn't be? But, as I said, life moved on. Emily was invaluable in ensuring that, comforting me about it when I needed her to, but never acting like it defined me now. Life moved on. 4 years later, I asked Emily to marry me. 5 years later, she was my incredible wife. 8 years, and she gave birth to the joy of our lives. Our daughter Lily. I loved my wife. Of course I did. But there's absolutely no feeling of adoration on this earth that compares to holding your own child in your arms. And yes, of course I still felt scarred by my experience all those years ago. One night, as we were in bed getting ready to sleep, I told her about it once more. How even though things are fine now, things are perfect now, I still had nightmares about the wall of flesh sometimes. I still get sent into near panic attack at the sight of an open wound. She held me in close. I know you do, love. I know you do, she murmured, her voice drowsy but full of care. But you've got me, don't you? You've got us. I closed my eyes and felt myself beginning to drift off as she held me closer still. I breathed in the beautiful smell of her rose-scented shampoo. It's okay, because I've got you. I've got you, she whispered. I've got you. 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 I fell forward into the man's arms. The cold air of the cellar enveloping me in an instant as I screamed out. I looked up and all around, stared at the yellow-suited men, still screaming and babbling incoherently. I laid in their arms, still smelling the rose-scented shampoo, though there was now something horribly wrong with it. Like how after you realize the trick of an optical illusion you can never see it as you originally light it. Pheromones. It turns out, the wall had been digesting me for quite some time indeed. I saw my reflection. I look emaciated, barely alive. It showed me wonderful things. Now, I sit alone in my cold, dark apartment, looking outside at gray skies. I think of my wife's smile. I think of my child's laughter. I want to go back. The house that calls. The town of Ashford was like any other, quiet, unassuming, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. It was nestled between rolling hills and thick forests. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed buried. But there was one place that no one spoke of above a whisper. A house that had stood on Blackthorn Hill for over a century. Rotting and forgotten, yet somehow always watching. Blackthorn House. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the Grayson family disappeared overnight, leaving their dinner half-eaten and their beds still warm. Some said they had been murdered, their bodies hidden within the walls. Others claimed they had walked away, vanishing into the woods, never to be seen again. But the children of Ashford told darker tales of a house that breathed, whispered, and called to those who dared step too close. Daniel Monroe never believed in ghost stories. He was a journalist, a man of reason. Superstition held no place in his life. But a good story did. When he first heard the murmurs of Blackthorn House, he dismissed them as small-town gossip. But something about the house gnawed at him, an itch in his mind that wouldn't go away. Perhaps it was the way the townspeople avoided speaking of it, the way their eyes darted away whenever he asked too many questions. Or maybe it was the dreams, the strange, vivid dreams of a house that seemed to know his name. So, one autumn evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he found himself standing before the towering house, notebook in hand. The windows were like dead eyes, the front door slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for him. The whisper was louder now, curling around his ears, sliding into his thoughts. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, he stepped inside. The air was thick, suffocating. Dust swirled in the golden light filtering through the cracked windows. Furniture, draped in white sheets, loomed like ghostly figures. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. The whisper turned into words. "Daniel, you came back." His breath hitched. He swung the flashlight wildly. But the house remained still. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. No one knew he was here. No one, except whatever was inside this house. The staircase groaned as he ascended, the wooden steps sagging beneath his weight. He found the master bedroom untouched, faded wallpaper peeling, the bed neatly made, but the vanity mirror was different. As he approached, his reflection twisted. His eyes darkened. His mouth curled into a smile that he did not make. Then the image spoke, though its lips never moved. You were here before. A jolt of cold terror gripped him. He had never set foot in this house before tonight, had he? The whispering voice filled his head now. No longer soft, but urgent. You have always been here. The walls trembled. A shadow detached itself from the corner, cooling into something solid. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. A woman emerged, pale, with hollow eyes and a stitched-shut mouth. Her fingers twitched, reaching for him. Memories crashed into him like a flood. The Graysons' disappearance, the hushed town, the truth buried beneath layers of forgotten time. He had been here before. He had lived here. He had died here. No, he whispered, stepping back, but the house swallowed his voice. The floor beneath him softened like flesh. The walls pulsed like a beating heart. He turned to run, but the doorway was gone. A mirror stood in its place, his reflection staring back at him, only now. His mouth was stitched shut, his eyes pleading for escape. The house had called him home, and it would never let him leave. The light from his flashlight sputtered, its glow fading as the room darkened. Shadows lengthened, stretching toward him like hungry hands. Daniel clawed at the walls, searching for a crack, a hidden door, anything to free him from the nightmare tightening its grip. But the house had no intention of letting him go. A cold wind swept through the room, though there were no open windows. The whispering grew louder, merging into an eerie chant. Daniel, stay with us? Daniel, you are home? The voices layered over each other, some familiar, some unrecognizable, all pressing against his skull like the weight of forgotten memories. Then he saw them. Figures began to emerge from the dark corners of the room, translucent yet distinct. The Grayson family. Their eyes were hollow pits of blackness, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The mother clutched a child to her chest, her arms skeletal, skin stretched thin. The father stood behind her, his mouth moving soundlessly, lips forming words Daniel could not hear. Something cold touched his shoulder. He spun around, heart hammering, only to come face to face with his reflection, only it wasn't him anymore. The figure in the mirror had no eyes, no mouth, only a gaping, endless void where a face should be. It raised a hand, fingers curling into a fist before slamming against the glass. Crack. The mirror splintered, fractures spreading like veins across the surface. The house shuddered, a deep groan reverberating through the walls. Daniel fell to his knees as the ground beneath him trembled, his screams swallowed by the growing cacophony of voices. You have always been here. The mirror shattered. Darkness consumed him. Days turned to weeks. The town spoke in hushed tones about the strange new legend of Blackthorn House. Some claimed they saw a shadow moving behind the windows at night. Others swore they heard whispers when they passed by. One evening, a group of teenagers dared each other to step inside. They laughed, flicking on their flashlights, and calling out into the emptiness. But when they reached the master bedroom, their laughter died. A mirror stood there, untouched by dust, gleaming in the dim light. And within its glass, a shadow loomed. It raised a hand, fingers pressing against the glass from the inside, mouth stitched shut, eyes pleading for escape. But the house never let anyone leave. Then, one night, a candle flickered to life in the master bedroom window. The whispering started again, soft at first, then insistent. Someone else was coming, and the house was waiting. A man appeared in my room to answer my prayers. The large man stood in the corner of my dark room, peering at me through puffy slits surrounded by a century's worth of deep eye bags and crust. Every breath his ancient body took was accompanied by loud wheezing, and the occasional band of elastic spittle dripped from a bulbous head, which was 2, maybe 3 times the size of a normal man's. I estimated his height to be close to 7 feet despite his Quasimodo-esque hunch, likely meaning his true size was much larger. Grease-covered, meaty hands hung limply at his sides, and long, jagged nails conjured images of him tearing into flesh and bone with ease. I cowered from the monstrous figure by my bedside, calculating how fast I could get the door open before he could move his hulking frame to drag me into the deepest pits of hell. We were at a stalemate. We analyzed each other for an uncomfortably long time, neither daring to make a move. There was an unspoken agreement that the first action of this encounter would set the stage for every succeeding event. I couldn't die here. A simple twitch of my foot in preparation for the sprint of my lifetime set this dark play into motion. His eyes grew to the size of baseballs, with pinpoint black dots tracking my every move. In hopes of creating some distance, I flung my bedsheets toward him, rolled to my knees, and scrambled forward like a frightened dog, hoping to escape. A primal scream erupted from my throat as I reached for the doorknob, my fingers barely touching it before I felt a sticky, warm feeling on my calf. I spun around and saw the man's hand had wholly wrapped around my leg like an anaconda suffocating its prey. Try as I might to kick the hand off of me, the immense strength of the homunculus was far beyond what the elderly appearance would suggest. The man's beak-like nose seemed to hone in on me, frantically wiggling in the air while he took in large sniffs in rapid succession. His disproportionately long arm creaked as it dragged me toward him. I scraped the carpet until my nails bled, kicking and screaming like a desperate animal caught in a bear trap. A deep sound rumbled from the man that resembled a slow laugh. Finally, he brought me to him. His face was adorned with a large smile filled with hundreds of crooked yellow teeth. For a moment, he simply looked me over. It felt like he could see every cell in my body. And then, he stopped. The man grabbed me by the shoulders and dropped me onto my bed. Again. I tried to make for the door. And again, I was dragged backward. This time, he made sure to slam me against the wall, before placing me back on my bed as punishment for trying to run. This time, he put his hulking frame in the path. And then, he spoke. He was slow and methodical. His voice was gruff, and his throat almost sounded as if full of swords. But it was still clear. You called for me. I said, holding back tears in an oncoming panic attack. The man puffed, stepped back, and pointed a long, crooked finger toward the ground. You called for me. Here, I am here, again. I shook my head and eked out a weak, no, I didn't. He stomped his foot, turned around, and made a harsh gurgle before turning back with his hands together in the form of a prayer. You called for me. A large smile crept back onto his face. His pupils rolled back into his head as his jaw unhinged from its previous position. And without moving his lips, a voice, almost like a record, came from his gut. And it was Jesus. It was mine. I was crying. A deep sorrow was evident in every inhale. No wonder. I had been extremely depressed. Things in my life weren't anywhere near what I expected at 32. Financial struggles developed as I slowly saw my hopes and dreams slipping away. I was becoming just another person. Another accidental birth who would eventually melt into the great gray fog of unremarkable, unimportant boringness. I'd leave no true mark on the world all the while. I'd have to deal with all the pain that came with it. The ever-growing darkness of the news cycle. My friends seemed to all be slipping away. My brother was sick. He didn't tell me with what, but he looked worse every time I saw him. My life was a constant cycle of blah and who cares, doing the same thing over and over and over again until eventually the grave called with a more permanent routine. And to top it off, I was lonely. A 3-year relationship had ended a couple months back. I was feeling the pain and bitterness of every moment I had to endure, knowing that despite my efforts, I wasn't good enough for other people despite seeing those who were objectively worse people be happy and raise families. Suffice it to say, I was very depressed. I wasn't religious. I left religion a while ago. But I suppose some repressed part of me held on to spirituality strongly enough to force me to say a prayer tonight. The same prayer now coming from this monster's mouth. Please, I don't know who or what is out there, I said, fighting back tears. I'm doing really bad right now. Very fucking bad. I don't know where I'm going or if it's even worth heading there. I've tried to be a good man. I haven't always been successful. But damn it, I've tried. If you're up there, please send me something to guide me in the direction I'm meant to go. I don't need to be a billionaire or a CEO. All I'm asking, all I need is a guardian angel to guide me towards purpose. And maybe, if I'm lucky, a bit of happiness. Please. When my begging ceased, the creature's jaw snapped back into place with a disgusting cracking sound. Its eyes rolled forward to focus on me, and it grinned again. Its smile came with a sudden realization. It took a step back, allowing me to stand, but it was as if my body was filled with concrete. No, no, I whispered as I shook my head. No, 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 this was my guardian angel. As if it could hear the thoughts in my head, it gave a slight nod, turned its hulking frame, and walked out of my door, somehow pulling its massive body through the relatively small doorway. I stood and watched it walk away, hoping it'd never return, but all it took was a glance back from the angel that I knew it wanted me to follow. And so I did. We walked out to the street and down the sidewalk. A quick look at my phone showed me it was close to 2 a.m. The odd car would pass by, but none so much as slowed down when passing the angel, and I let it lead me to wherever it needed us to go. Neither of us spoke. We walked for what felt like over an hour until we finally reached a foul-smelling canal. The angel pointed a crooked finger down. I stood at the canal's edge, heart pounding against my chest. Something was down there, but my mind refused to acknowledge it. When I finally mustered the courage to use the flashlight on my phone, it trembled in my hand. There, laying perfectly still, was a man. His face appeared swollen, his puffy neck pulled to an unnatural angle, and what seemed to be the protrusions from broken bones poked through his clothes. I'd never seen a dead body before, and even so, despite that, it wasn't the shock of that moment that truly made my skin crawl. No, when I shone a light onto the man's face, I saw that he was me. How could this be possible? I wasn't dead. I didn't do the things I had thought about last night. Had I? Was all of this some sort of hallucination? No, no, this can't be me. How could I be dead? I'm standing right here. I yelled at the angel. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding or an awful nightmare. I turned to the angel, expecting some kind of answer, but all I got in return was that horrible wide smile. Say something. Damn it, I'm not dead, I shouted, furious at what the angel had shown me. It has to be some sort of trick or hallucination it was inducing. Stop smiling. I'm not dead. I'm not dead. The angel took a slow step toward me, and I backed up. It took another step. This time, I stumbled. Fear shot through my body. My movements were shaky. I contemplated grabbing a fistful of dirt and throwing it at the creature to distract it while I ran. But thoughts of how that plan had failed back at my apartment flashed through my mind. Maybe if I just turned and ran? Could I go to a friend's house? No, no one was close enough on foot. A police station? None are open at 2 a.m. And besides, I couldn't tell them I was being pursued by an angel from hell. What if I camped inside a convenience store? Just until I felt it was safe. I settled on my plan. But the angel had me by the jugular before I could turn and run. It held me in the air as I struggled to breathe. Its smile seemed to be growing more expansive, and its dark pupils now filled the entirety of its sclera. It held me over the edge of the canal, stretching out its arm until I was directly over my own dead body. Get in, it shouted with a visceral hiss. Get in. Its eyes flashed rainbow colors. Get in, get in, get in, get in. It shook me up and down. Your body, your future. It mocked me, unhinging its jaw again and playing back the sound of me crying. I screamed, begging anyone or anything to save me from this demon. I don't want to die. I pleaded. I don't want that future. I just want to be happy. I struggled against the angel, but its ice-cold grip locked me in place. I feared that if it didn't kill me after dropping me into my dead body down there, it would do so by freezing my airway. Despite its cold touch around my neck, I could feel my skin begin to burn. Scorching flames simultaneously appeared from the dead body below. With each passing second, I began to sweat more profusely, every droplet raising the columns of fire toward me. The undeniable sound of maggots crawling over each other to reach soft flesh filled my ears. The unmistakable sight of cockroaches streaming out from under my clothes added a new layer of panic from within. All the while, a rising chorus of sobbing from thousands. No, millions of tortured souls, each experiencing their own version of damnation, played in the background. This was hell. This is what awaited me in death. What felt like hours rolled by until finally, I felt solid ground under my feet. The fire was gone. The insects had left my body. All I experienced was the cool air, and the angel looked down at me. This time, it was frowning. Again, it spoke. This time in a voice I hadn't heard before. This one was soft and caring. You don't want to die yet, do you? My child, you want happiness and love? I tried to speak, but no words came, so I simply shook my head. The angel nodded. You are loved, my child. We are watching over you. For a moment, I swore I could see the outline of white wings extending behind it. It took a step toward me and placed a hand on my forehead. For a long moment, I felt bliss. It was true peace like I hadn't since I was a young boy. The world opened up. Boundless opportunity and energy were before me. I felt the good of humanity and the most profound urge to share that goodness. There was nothing I could do but smile at this indescribably beautiful feeling. And then, the cold blade of reality pierced through the bliss. I saw pain, suffering, and sorrow. In an instant, I experienced the slow fall of humanity. The beginning of the end seemed simple enough. A slow degradation of human connection. Deeper divisions between people. The fall of objective truth. Minor issues that the common man believed would eventually disappear because surely our species was too intelligent and advanced to let it ruin us. Then, the problems grew out of control. What once seemed to be symptoms of a changing society became defining features of an increasingly bitter and cold world. All the while, the degradation of our planet, the dwindling of our resources, and a species who opted toward acts of violence over coming together to find solutions. Primarily because they couldn't agree on the fundamental issues or causes at hand. Led to wars, disease came, pain, suffering, great fires, a billion lost lives, man and beast, among the rubble of once great cities, a spiral into a collective madness that drew horrors and a broken society. Leaving humans so much different, so much more savage, hateful, raw, than any incarnation before it. I saw horrors beyond horrors I dare not repeat here. But what I can say is that there's a lot that can destroy a world. I saw how all of these things, tiny little things, come together to form monsters. They intermingled, they fed each other, they grew, until pain was the only thing man could understand. This was the world that awaited us. When he removed his hand from my head, I found myself on my knees while the visions melted away. It was a future that I hated. I looked up at the smiling angel. His calm voice had returned. You know what you must do then. Yes. My answer was as sure as anything I'd ever contemplated in my life. Yes. Satisfied. The angel gently guided my head toward its cracked lips, gave me a soft kiss on the forehead, and pulled me into a tight hug. I cried in its embrace. And then, unexpectedly, it began to sing to me in the most beautiful voice. For what it's worth, the song was joyous, maybe the most beautiful voice I had ever heard. It gave me a hint of that bliss I had initially felt. For a moment, I actually believed everything would be okay. Just as soon as it had come, it was gone. I walked home, knowing what came next. The very next day, I went to worship. I won't say which specific belief system or type of institution, but the angel made it very clear. The visions it gave me were accurate. The fall of humanity was coming. Not only that, but the specific belief system I was now part of had a hand in that downfall. A significant role. At that, its angels were watching and smiling down. One may ask, of course, why I'd choose to be part of something that I know will lead to something horrible for all of humanity. The answer is pretty simple. The alternative is death, as wrong as it sounds. I don't know when that future will come. I may be part of it. I may not. But death is a guarantee. It will come for me as it does for us all. But through worship, I have a purpose. I have a group of people to share philosophy with, goals I can stick to, and a community to turn to. For the moment, I can defer the eternity of suffering and pain that awaits me. Even if or when my joining contributes to suffering down the line. I don't care. If you felt what I felt, as I was suspended over my own body, if you knew how long a few mere seconds felt, you'd do anything to postpone that as well. It's not like I can stop what's to come anyway. And hey, I have a purpose for the first time in a long time. I'm happy. Even met a woman. Ultimately, I choose to take the wins where I can and control what I can within my own life. And that's good enough for me. Hell, if I get lucky, maybe I'll forget any of this ever happened. However, writing this out seems counterintuitive to that goal. But perhaps that's why I'm doing it. Maybe part of me believes I shouldn't forget. I don't know. All that said, there is another significant change in my life. I can still feel my angel watching me sometimes. often with more than one pair of eyes, as if he isn't the only thing from the darkness peering into the hearts of men, guiding them in such a way beyond our grasp. I still wonder just why they do it. For entertainment? For curiosity? Whatever the reason, when I'm alone in the dark, I always keep my eyes shut until the sun illuminates every corner of my room. Supernatural Vigilante Association, the Time Traveler. I stood on the roof of the derelict tower block, the cold night sky above me as I waited impatiently for my source to arrive. Glancing upwards, I failed to see a single star due to light pollution, and I found this depressing, suffocating even. The crescent moon was visible, however, if barely. Its dim light gave me some comfort, a temporary respite from the chaos occurring below me. Reluctantly, I gazed downwards at the burning city, listening to the terrible cacophony of frantic shouts, trampling feet, beeping horns, distant sirens, and sporadic gunfire. All this was interspersed with the far-off din of rotor blades, as police helicopters hovered over the city like hungry insects, their spotlights focusing on trouble spots dotted across the boroughs. I shook my head in disgust as the smoke from the burning buildings and vehicles hit my nostrils. This city, my hometown, had once again been engulfed by anarchy and violence, as rioting had broken out across the metropolis, a fiery chaos which the city's police were seemingly unable to contain. I felt sick to my stomach whilst observing these violent scenes from my high viewing point. This rioting was undoubtedly worse than the violence which broke out several months back. The city was burning and it was uncertain whether the community would ever recover. But this wasn't what bothered me the most. What really ate away at me was the guilt I felt, because I realized I was at least partly responsible for this mess. The stories I'd published, the tales of the SVA and its secretive operatives, my work had stirred something in people. A simmering resentment and anger which had been lingering just below the surface, waiting to explode. Why had I chased this story? What had I hoped to achieve? Was it anything more than naked personal ambition? I'd been asking myself these questions since my last interview with Quinn, which had ended in tragedy. But it wasn't about me anymore. I had never been a supporter of the Supernatural Vigilante Association. In fact, I'd always condemned their actions and entire philosophy. But my journalism unfortunately had the opposite effect to what I intended. Instead of exposing the brutal organization for what they were, I'd breathed fresh life into a dying beast. The mobs rampaging through the streets had their chance, shouting furiously and passionately as they attacked police cars and burnt down City Hall, all whilst crying, "Free Tabitha," "Quinn lives," "Mandrake for president," and "Victory to the SVA." I wanted to portray these vigilantes as flawed human beings who'd taken the wrong path. Not to garner sympathy for them, but that's what had happened. And of course, Mandrake was more than willing to take advantage of this surge in support, stoking the fires with his own unique brand of ultra-violence. To be fair, the vigilante leader was still on the run and his capabilities were limited. Mandrake no longer had an army of superhumans under his command, as most of his former soldiers were either dead or in prison. Nevertheless, he wasn't entirely without resources. I'd closely followed the news reports over the last few days and had noted attacks which matched Mandrake's unique fingerprint: a rapist castrated, a corrupt cop assassinated, a mob bar bombed. Even amongst all this chaos, Mandrake could still make his mark. The whole ugly scenario sickened me, and I'd spent many sleepless nights questioning why I'd ever started this investigation. Just then I felt the first cold drops of rain falling on my head as I stood on the rooftop pondering my unfortunate situation. Looking up, I saw dark clouds forming in the night sky, cursing as I tightened my coat and shivered. What the hell was I doing here? Why had I even come tonight? Good questions, although unfortunately I didn't have good answers. It wasn't about the story anymore. Not really. Sure, I was curious to meet the mysterious vigilante Mandrake had lined up for me. Still, I no longer craved fame, recognition, or a Pulitzer. What I really wanted was for this nightmare to end. My exhausted brain was hardly thinking logically by this point, but I believed this chaos would only end when Mandrake was brought down. The vigilante put himself at risk every time he came out of hiding to meet me. So perhaps this would be the time he got caught. I considered this whilst retreating towards the staircase, seeking shelter from the coming deluge. The weather was vile, but perhaps the rain would quell the fires. Why had Mandrake chosen this location for our meet? Sure, the views were fantastic, if you appreciated the sight of a city tearing itself apart. But a rooftop was indeed a strange choice. Mandrake had always previously picked venues with at least one clear escape route in case the cops or bounty hunters came knocking. But this derelict tower seemed like a trap with no obvious way out. I'd had to climb 50 flights of stairs just to get up here, leaving me exhausted, flustered and irritated. Then again, maybe Mandrake didn't want to get out. He was living on borrowed time after all, and perhaps he'd chosen this lonely rooftop for his last stand, planning to go down in a blaze of glory while I was there as a witness, the ambitious journalist who would write up the graphic details of his heroic demise. The thought brought a cold chill down my spine. I wanted to see Mandrake's reign of terror brought to an end, but would prefer he was arrested and put on trial rather than turned into a martyr. And I certainly didn't want to be caught in the crossfire if and when bullets started flying. In that moment I did seriously consider abandoning this foolhardy enterprise. But suddenly I heard heavy footsteps ascending the staircase and an all too familiar voice calling out to me. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. What a pleasure to see you again." I turned to see a figure ascending the darkened staircase, illuminating the steps before him with the torch function on his phone. Standing tall, I waited until the newcomer's face was lit up before I answered his call. "Mr. Mandrake, I was beginning to worry you wouldn't show up." The vigilante chuckled dryly as he continued his slow ascent. He showed no signs of tiring despite having climbed so many flights of stairs. I looked over my companion with interest as he walked into the light, noting the changes in his appearance and demeanor since our last meeting. On that previous occasion, I was shocked at how far Mandrake had deteriorated. He'd looked disheveled and exhausted, on edge and close to breaking point. Honestly, I feared Quinn's suicide might finish him off. But the Mandrake now stood before me looked like a man renewed, his eyes bright with fiery passion and with a charismatic smile plastered across his face. I noticed how he no longer wore his usual tailored suit, instead being dressed all in black with a leather jacket and a polo neck up to his chin. Perhaps this was his wartime uniform. Mandrake's grin widened as he walked up the final steps to meet me, holding out his hand in a show of friendship whilst doing so. "Now, Mr. Carter, I thought you knew me better than that. I wouldn't miss our meeting for the world." I took his hand to shake. Even though it made me uncomfortable, I couldn't help wondering how many lives those hands had taken. I felt relieved whenever I was able to pull away from his sweaty palm. "Interesting choice for a meeting place," I said sarcastically, whilst looking the killer straight in his dark eyes. Mandrake didn't blink as he spoke his answer. "The building is derelict and away from prying eyes. True, the roof is open to the elements, not to mention police helicopters. But I have a room ready for us, 1 floor down." I nodded my head, hardly surprised at the last-minute change of venue. Mandrake liked to keep me on my toes, to remind me he was in control. But I had a trump card up my sleeve: information. You see, I'd been doing a lot of digging since the fateful night of the Quinn interview, and I'd learned something very important: Mandrake's true identity and his family history. I could reveal the vigilante's secret at any time, and yet I hesitated to do so, because I feared how he'd respond. "Please follow me," Mandrake instructed, and so I did, walking after him and down the staircase. The room Mandrake had organized for our meet wasn't much to look at: a dark, damp and empty office space littered with overturned furniture and assorted junk spread across the stained carpet. From the wide windows we could still see the chaos on the streets below, the city-wide riots which showed little signs of abating. We sat facing each other across a desk illuminated by a battery-powered lantern placed upon it. "So, here we are again," Mandrake said with a thin smile. "I do hope this meeting goes better than our last." I noted a sadness in his eyes despite the grin on his lips. And I could relate. Mandrake and I had a shared grief now. We'd both been witness to Quinn's tragic death, as the troubled vigilante blew his brains out mere seconds after delivering his final confession. It chilled me to think back to that fateful night as I recalled the horrific sight of the mentalist's still warm body sprawled in the back of his van. I didn't comment, however, instead glancing out the window at the ongoing rioting. Sadly, the rain had only been a brief shower, and so the fires still burnt fiercely, their black smoke rising into an even blacker sky. "I suppose this makes you happy," I muttered bitterly whilst glaring back at Mandrake. The vigilante's eyes narrowed and his smile disappeared as he delivered a thoughtful reply. My feelings are mixed. Mr. Carter, you think anarchy and senseless violence pleases me. But this simply isn't the case. I have dedicated my life to fighting for justice. After all, he chuckled softly before continuing. Still, I can't say it's not satisfying to observe the cops and feds who've spent so long pursuing me. And now they're under attack, stretched to breaking point as a result of their own brutality and incompetence. But I believe this is only the beginning. Their whole rotten and corrupt system is collapsing in front of our very eyes. This is a revolution, Mr. Carter. The people are furious and hungry for change. And they know who is here to save them. It's on their lips and in their chants, SVA. Mandrake, they know that I am the one to lead them to the promised land. To a bright future where justice is a reality. And not just an empty word. Mandrake's voice had risen to a near crescendo by this point. And I genuinely feared for his sanity. The vigilante was clearly suffering from delusions of grandeur. And possibly even a messiah complex. Did he truly believe these riots were all for him? That he could overthrow the government and take control? This was total madness. As I looked into Mandrake's crazed eyes, I felt a strong urge to reveal what I knew about his sordid past. This revelation would certainly burst his bubble. I didn't know how he'd react. But nevertheless I did seriously consider speaking out. But the timing wasn't right. In that moment, I heard footsteps from the far side of the abandoned office. Turning my head to see a new figure emerging from the shadows. "Oh, our special guest has arrived," Mandrake exclaimed enthusiastically. "Come join us, comrade." The man who walked out from the shadows was striking and yet somehow unremarkable at the same time. A large man with a long and disheveled dark beard. His sharp blue eyes shone in the dim light as they focused upon me with a chilling intensity. He walked slowly towards the table whilst holding out his huge hand to shake. "Mr. Carter, I am pleased to introduce one of our finest SVA volunteers, Mr. Ralph Fence," said Mandrake. With some apprehension, I stood and shook with Mr. Fence, my own hand being nearly crushed in the process. Fence towered over me, his intense eyes looking me up and down as he sized me up. This tense moment lasted for longer than I would have liked, until eventually Fence grabbed an overturned chair and joined us at the desk. It took me another few seconds before I felt brave enough to ask a question. "Forgive me, Mr. Fence," I said cautiously. "I have studied the history of the Supernatural Vigilante Association since its foundation. But I'm not familiar with your name." I didn't know how Fence would react to the question but was surprised when he bellowed out in laughter. I was baffled, and it was left up to Mandrake to offer an explanation of sorts. "You won't have heard of Fence or his operations, Mr. Carter. He is our most prized asset and we've kept him a closely guarded secret." I raised an eyebrow, surprised but none the wiser following Mandrake's explanation. "I'm afraid I don't follow," was my puzzled reply. Mandrake smiled knowingly before answering. "Well, let me put it this way. Have you ever heard of the Downtown Mall massacre?" I pondered for a moment but drew a blank. "No sir. I know of the mall of course. But I don't recall a massacre or indeed any serious crimes linked to that venue." Mandrake nodded his head smugly and then began to list off facts. As if he were reading from a newspaper or Wikipedia article. The Downtown Mall massacre took place on the 4th of July 2022 while the venue was packed with holiday shoppers. A single gunman with a history of mental health issues entered the premises shortly after 9 a.m. armed with a semi-automatic rifle and 2 handguns. In the space of a mere 17 minutes, the gunman shot 36 members of the public, killing 21 of them. He was then cornered by responding officers and committed suicide by shooting himself through the head. The massacre was the worst mass shooting in our city's history, and many families were forever broken by the scale of their losses. The mood across the desk was somber, but I broke the mood by scoffing in contempt. "Come on, Mandrake. No such event ever took place. You know this." I looked to Mandrake and then to Fence, only to be met with cold stares. "You don't know about the shooting because Mr. Fence went to extraordinary lengths to prevent the massacre from happening," Mandrake answered through clenched teeth. 21 people are alive today because of him, living their lives and spending time with their loved ones. They'll never know what was done to save them, well, not until now. Not until you tell the story. Mr. Carter. I frowned, slightly irritated by the cryptic response. I still don't understand, I said. Mandrake smiled again before breaking eye contact and sitting up from his chair. Well, I think it's better if Fence explains it to you himself. I need to check on our security arrangements. So I'll leave you gentlemen to it. With that, Mandrake walked swiftly across the office floor and disappeared into the shadows. And I was left alone with Fence, struggling to hold his hard gaze as I waited for the vigilante to speak. Fence's voice was gruff and deep, as he asked, "So, what do you want to know?" I was somewhat taken aback by his directness and the mysterious way this meeting had transpired. "Well, Mr. Fence," I eventually answered, "I like to start at the beginning with my interviewees. I'm interested in where you come from, when you first identified your special abilities, and how you came to join the SVA." The vigilante nodded his head and stroked his beard, remaining silent for a moment as if deep in thought. I got the impression that Fence was a man of few words, and so I'd need to struggle to get the story out of him. "Well, sir, I can't say my childhood was anything special. I wasn't a victim of some horrific crime. My family was normal, loving parents and a comfortable upbringing. I only realized I was different when my grandfather passed away. I was 10, old enough to understand death but not mature enough to fully process the grief. But that's neither here nor there. What's important is the episode which occurred at my granddaddy's funeral." "Oh, yes?" I said, my curiosity now piqued. Fence was a mystery to me, and I had no idea where this story was going. "Yeah, I was raised in a Catholic family," Fence continued, "and that meant an open casket at the wake. I remember seeing the old-timer inside the lined coffin, his eyes closed, face bloated, and skin looking like wax. The other kids my age were freaked out by the sight of his body. But I was fascinated by it. Call it a morbid curiosity if you will, but I felt the urge to reach out and touch his cheek. I didn't know what to expect. I guess I just wanted to make a connection with my grandfather one last time. But what happened next was beyond my wildest dreams. I saw a glint in Fence's eye and a faint smile beneath his black beard. Clearly, this was a treasured memory for the man. It was terrifying at first, because I didn't understand what had happened to me. You see, one minute I was standing in the back room of the church with a line of mourners behind me, and the next I was transported through time and space to a location and year that was quite impossible. My jaw dropped and heart rate quickened as I looked Fence directly in the eye, trying to find any signs of deceit. I'd heard and reported on some extraordinary SVA stories before, tales of the supernatural and paranormal. But what Fence was saying was out of this world. "So, wait, you're saying that you were teleported to another place?" I asked in amazement. "Yeah," Fence replied calmly, "but I wasn't just taken to a new location. It was also a different time. That is to say, I traveled backwards and attended an event which occurred decades before I was even born, my grandfather's 10th birthday." "My God, are you serious?" I exclaimed in disbelief. How did you know? I mean, how could you tell?" "Well, in truth I only really figured it out after I got back. It all happened so fast. And I was only there for 5 minutes. It seemed like longer, but 5 minutes is all I ever get. I recognized details I'd seen in old black and white photographs. And when I saw my grandfather he was the spitting image of me. But the oddest thing is, I was able to interact with my environment. I could touch the furniture, smell the candles, even taste the cake. And the people could see me too. I was nervous and so stayed at the back of the room. But a few of the kids gave me funny looks while they played. I guess they wondered who this kid in the black suit was and why he'd gate crashed the party. But it was a birthday party and there were lots of kids around. Not to mention the parents who had their hands full. So, I was able to stay in the background and just observe. Hell, I didn't even approach my grandfather in his child form. Didn't know what would happen if I did. "I can't believe it," I said whilst shaking my head. "How is this even possible?" "Beats me," Fence answered with a shrug of his shoulders. "I didn't understand it at the time. Still don't really. But this is the gift I was born with. The ability to connect with the dead and travel in time to a key moment in the deceased's past. All by merely touching their cold skin. But my forays into history are only temporary. 5 minutes, that's the limit. I left my grandfather's birthday party as abruptly as I arrived." fading away from the past and being thrust back into the present. Because suddenly I found myself back at the wake with a queue of impatient mourners behind me. My mind was racing as I tried to make sense of this extraordinary tale. The implications of what Fence was saying were disturbing, but I had to learn more. How did you use this unique ability? I asked cautiously. Well, it was some time before I was able to repeat the process. Fence said with a crude smile. The average kid doesn't encounter dead bodies too often, and there were no other funerals for the next few years. But the thrill I felt that day, it didn't leave me. I couldn't just leave the experience as a one-off. That's why I took a job as a mortician's assistant when I turned 18. I raised my eyebrows, unable to contain my shock. I know what you're thinking. Fence replied with a nod. It's pretty screwed up, right? But at first my intentions were innocent enough. I wanted to test and hone my powers, of course. But there was something else too. When I touched the dead, I connected with them. I could see glimpses of their past, see what kind of person they were in life. Before long I realized I could visit specific points in a person's life, key moments which shaped them. And I could change things too. I was able to interact with the environment after all. It was small things at first, minor changes and adjustments to make someone's life better. The trouble is, not all of the dead I encountered were good people. Some had done terrible things during their lives, and a few had escaped the mortal coil without punishment. I felt my stomach drop as suddenly it all came together in my head. The words almost stuck in my throat, but I had to ask the question. What can you tell me about the downtown mall massacre? I inquired. Fence sighed deeply, looking down at his boots before he finally answered. The perpetrator in my timeline was a 31-year-old man called Daniel Stone. You won't have heard of him, for reasons that will become obvious. What can I say about Mr. Stone? He was a monster, obviously, but there were no obvious signs that he was capable of murder. Stone had a history of mental illness, but no documented record of violence. The man was a drifter and underachiever, unable to hold down a job or maintain a long-term relationship. Still, being a social outcast doesn't usually drive a man to murder. And then there's the nature versus nurture argument. I found nothing in Daniel's family history which could explain what he did. By all accounts, he had a stable upbringing and 2 loving parents. What's more, his younger sister Tara qualified as a doctor, working as a pediatrician in St. Mary's Children's Hospital. In Daniel's case, the apple had fallen very far from the tree. Fence paused his account, continuing to look down at his shoes and refusing to meet my eye. I knew the behavior of a guilty man when I saw it, and realized Fence was building up to telling me something awful. It seemed he was trying to justify whatever he'd done, but I needed to press him for more. What happened to him, Fence? I asked carefully. What did you do to Daniel Stone? The vigilante sighed again, louder this time. There followed another lengthy pause before he next spoke, his voice now starting to crack under the emotional strain. I was a sworn-in member of the SVA by the time of the massacre. Mandrake had approached me about 6 months before and I'd agreed to join his organization. I was eager to use my powers to prevent evil from occurring. But Mandrake had bigger plans for me. He told me I was special, that my powers were beyond anything he'd seen before. The boss wanted to keep me in reserve and use my powers for something big. Well, the opportunity came after the mall shooting. Stone was dead by his own hand, having taken the lives of 21 innocent souls during his mindless killing spree. Many of the victims came to my morgue, but Mandrake pulled some strings and got Stone onto my slab. It was all coming together in my head, and I didn't like the picture I was seeing. So, Mandrake's sole contribution was getting you access to the body? I asked. Not quite, he answered defensively. He gave the orders, and I followed them. And of course, there was the pep talk. Pep talk? I exclaimed, not knowing whether to feel amazed or disgusted. Fence looked me straight in the eye in that moment, a renewed intensity entering his gruff voice as he tried to turn the tables. Let me ask you something, Mr. Carter. If you could go back in time and kill a baby Hitler or Stalin, would you do it? Could you take a child's life if you knew he'd grow up to be a monster? Could you kill one to potentially save millions? I saw where Fence was going with this. He was posing an old moral dilemma, one which had previously been hypothetical, but Fence's unique powers were a game changer. Nevertheless, It was a crude analogy and I wouldn't let this stand. Daniel Stone was no Hitler. I said firmly. No, he wasn't. Fence acknowledged. But the same principle applies. By taking one life, I could save 21 people. That's the argument Mandrake sold to me. But that's still murder, I exclaimed in anger. There were other ways you could have stopped him. Like what? Fence shot back, his huge body now trembling with pent-up emotion. Don't you think I considered every other possibility before resorting to this? I only have 5 minutes. Remember? And besides, it's nature over nurture. Nothing could have prevented Stone from becoming a mass killer. Except his own death. I was far than convinced but felt my outburst had been unprofessional. And I certainly didn't wish to provoke Fence's anger. Apologies, I said in a conciliatory voice. Please tell me what happened. Sure, Fence replied in a somber tone. I've gone this far, and I guess I'm going to hell anyway. I could tell the account was taking its toll on Fence, and I did fear a similar outcome to the Quinn fiasco. Really, I should have stopped the interview right there and then. But to my eternal shame, I pressed on. The operation began like all my previous journeys. Sure, I was as nervous as hell. But I touched Stone's cheek and was taken back to 1991. I found myself standing in Daniel Stone's bedroom, with Disney character motifs on the walls and a stars and moon mobile hanging over his crib. And there was baby Daniel, a toddler with innocent eyes and soft skin, giggling innocently as he looked up at me and smiled. I guess he didn't recognize me as a threat. Jesus, I swore in disbelief. I know, Fence replied, the guilt now evident in his voice as tears formed in his deep blue eyes. I'll admit that I almost backed out at the last minute. Seeing that infant before me, the thought of harming him went against every instinct in my body. But then I remembered Mandrake's words and thought of those 21 people whose lives would be brought to a violent end if I didn't act. Fence sighed deeply once again, forcing himself to speak the next words. I lifted a pillow from the sideboard and held it over the baby's head. Then I pushed down, ignoring the child's muffled cries and struggles, and I didn't release the pressure until he stopped moving. I saw Fence's large body trembling and his foot tapping on the office floor. I'd known where this story was going, but hearing Fence confess to the heinous crime was truly sickening. Still, I couldn't help but feel some sympathy for the vigilante, knowing the heavy burden he carried on his shoulders. So, that was that, I said solemnly. Daniel Stone died in infancy and the downtown mall massacre never took place. Fence snorted before replying in a bitter tone. I wish it was that simple. You see, the deed was done before my 5 minutes in 1991 were up. So, I was forced to stand over the baby's corpse until the timeline corrected itself and I was pulled back into the present. That would have been tolerable, I guess. But I got the shock of my life when I saw the door to the bedroom slowly opening. I gasped before spluttering out my next question. Who was it? The boy's mother, he answered in shame. I thought I'd been quiet. But I guess she heard something. Or maybe it was just the maternal instinct. You know, it's strange. I can hardly remember any details about her appearance, the clothes she wore, how she kept her hair. All I can recall is the horror in the mother's eyes when she saw her dead boy, and the piercing scream she emitted as she ran from the doorway in a blind panic. Instinctively I sprinted after her and down the hallway. I didn't have a plan. It wasn't my intention to hurt her, that wasn't the mission. I just wanted to stop her screaming. He shook his head before clenching and unclenching his fist. It all happened so fast. We struggled at the top of the staircase, and suddenly she was falling. I reached out and tried to grab the woman, but it was already too late. She tumbled down the stairs like a bag of spuds, hitting the ground hard, her neck snapping like a twig. I stared down at her dead eyes, frozen in horror at what I'd just done, and I was only shaken from my shock-induced trance by a furious roar from further down the corridor. I turned my head and saw the boy's father dressed in blue jeans and a white vest. The man was holding a baseball bat and cried out in bloody fury as he charged towards me whilst swinging his bat. I didn't resist or run, instead merely standing still as the vengeful father came at me. Frankly, I didn't care if he beat me to death given what I'd just done. But wouldn't you know it? In that very moment my journey into the past abruptly ended, and I disappeared from that place before being thrust back into the now altered present. My mind was racing and I found myself literally speechless in the moments which followed. The butterfly effect caused by Fence's time-traveling vigilantism was substantial. But it was even worse than I thought. Did you look into the Stone family after you got back? I asked sheepishly, part of me not wanting to hear the answer. I did, Fence replied reluctantly, although I wish I hadn't frankly. Still, I had to face up to what I'd done. Mr. Stone took the blame for my crimes, as he was accused of murdering his wife and infant son. At the trial, he ranted and raved about a man who invaded his family home, committed the murders, and then disappeared into thin air. He was telling the truth, of course. But the judge thought Mr. Stone was crazy and so committed him to a psychiatric hospital. He sighed deeply before continuing. The poor bastard died in there. Hung himself. That was another death on my conscience. But it's not what bothers me the most. No? I said in surprise. Afraid not. Fence confirmed with a solemn nod of his head. You see, Mrs. Stone was 3 months pregnant when she died. She was carrying Daniel's younger sister, Tara. You'll find no record of her, because in this timeline Tara was never born, thanks to me. I robbed that girl of a chance at life. And it gets worse. Tara was a doctor in the original unaltered timeline. I'm the only one who remembers this. I often think of how many lives she would have saved during her medical career. Would her good work have offset the evil committed by her brother? Who can say? All I know is this. I played God and destroyed that family. And I had no right doing so. I looked to Fence in near astonishment. Honestly, I'd expected the vigilante to try to justify his heinous actions. And yet, Fence had admitted he was wrong, that the ends didn't justify the means in this case. But the time traveler didn't hold all the responsibility, as his next statement confirmed. Damn Mandrake! Fence exclaimed angrily, his blue eyes lighting up with a fiery intensity. Damn that son of a bitch to hell. I wish I never met him. I was still trying to think of an appropriate response to the vigilante's strong words when we were suddenly interrupted by an almighty din and bright light emanating from the far side of the office window. Both Fence and I jumped up from our chairs, temporarily blinded by the artificial light and near deafened by the heavy noise of spinning rotor blades. Looking out, I realized a police helicopter was hovering in the night sky directly opposite the derelict building we occupied, using its high-powered searchlight to illuminate our floor. The authorities had tracked us down, and now was the time for reckoning. This is the police, came the call from the chopper's loudspeakers. Get down on your knees and put your hands behind your heads. I was inclined to do as instructed. I hadn't committed any crimes after all, and the newspaper's lawyers could secure my release from custody within a matter of hours. Fence seemed unsure, however. He faced the grim prospect of arrest and facing the consequences of his actions. I looked to my vigilante companion as the searchlight illuminated us both. Honestly, I believe he was on the verge of surrender. But then Mandrake burst back into the space, intervening in a typically violent manner. I turned my head in time to see the fanatical vigilante charging across the office floor, pulling a machine pistol from underneath his jacket as he came. Die you motherfuckers, he screamed, a second before opening fire towards the chopper. The din of gunfire added to the violent cacophony of sound, and the bullets easily shattered the glass window, striking the hovering aircraft and taking out its searchlight. The chopper wasn't armed and the pilot lost his nerve, retreating from the shattered window and ascending into the dark skies above. Mandrake cried out in triumph as the cold night's air hit us, and he continued firing at the chopper until his magazine was empty. With the immediate threat averted, Mandrake turned towards us before and bellowed out his orders. We need to leave. Now. Next. Mandrake holstered his weapon and pulled out his cell phone, using the torch function to light the way as he proceeded across the office floor. I looked to Fence and saw the despair in his eyes, like he was caught in Mandrake's spell and couldn't escape it. He followed his leader and I reluctantly walked after them both, still unwilling to turn my back on this story. We exited the office and entered the internal stairwell leading downwards, only to find our path blocked. We heard the loud clumping of heavy boots on stairs and saw torches pointing upwards, lights affixed to assault rifles and carried by black-clad SWAT team members. The cops were coming up the stairs whilst we wanted to head down. It seemed our only escape route was blocked, and there was no doubt who the cops were after. Mandrake, shouted the SWAT leader as he aimed his rifle upwards and caught the vigilante in his torchlight. You're finished, asshole. Give up or I'll blow your fucking head off. I didn't see how the elusive Mandrake would escape this ambush. But of course he had another ace up his sleeve. The vigilante didn't even blink as he entered a short code into his cell phone. And a second later, all hell broke loose. There was a blinding light and deafening roar below us, clearly followed by a huge blast of hot air which threw me off my feet. I fell heavily to the ground, my head spinning and ears ringing. Fence was the one who helped me up, offering his huge right hand and dragging me up to my feet. I was still dazed but forced myself to look down at the now burning staircase which was covered in blood and guts. Whatever booby trap Mandrake planted had done the job, blowing the SWAT team to pieces and littering the staircase with their broken bodies. I felt sick as I observed the scene of bloody carnage below. Most of the cops were dead, but a few clung to life despite their missing limbs, crying out in agony as they slowly bled out. My jaw dropped as I turned to Mandrake in disgust, saying, "What the hell have you done?" The vigilante leader merely shrugged his shoulders dismissively, showing no remorse or even basic humanity. "Those men came here to kill me. I am entitled to act in self-defense. Every war has its casualties." I could no longer contain my disgust at Mandrake as I remonstrated with him for his callous and murderous actions. "This is all just a game to you, isn't it?" I exclaimed angrily, speaking up to be heard over the groans of the dying officers. Mandrake made a point of loading a fresh magazine into his gun as he answered coolly. "On the contrary, Mr. Carter, I take this very seriously. Justice is my life's mission and I'm prepared to die for the cause." I snorted in contempt, as the vigilante's fanatical words only increased my anger, and I spoke before I had a chance to think of the consequences. "Of course, Mandrake, you're a tough guy, right? A soldier who never backs away from the fight. But you weren't always this way, isn't that true? You see, Mandrake, I've discovered your true identity. Your real name is Seth Peterson and you grew up on the city's south side. Your father was a violent drunk who beat and molested his wife and children. One night he was hurting your little sister while you cowered under the covers. But your mother wasn't taking it anymore, was she? That night she blew your daddy's head off with a 12 gauge. Your mommy went to prison and your new sister were sent into foster case. You never stood up to your abusive father, did you, Mandrake? But you've made up for it since. This burning rage inside of you, the uncontrollable lust for bloody vengeance. That's the spark which lit the fire. And now the entire city is burning, thanks to you." My rant had been ill-advised. I'd discovered the truth about Mandrake just 3 days before and was in two minds whether to confront him with this information. But now I'd blurted it out, and there was no way of telling how the vigilante leader would react. I looked on fearfully as Mandrake's expression turned from shock to fury, his face going red with rage. I saw his grip tightening on the handle of his gun and genuinely feared Mandrake would shoot me down in cold blood. Thankfully, he regained some level of calm and composure, a crude smile returning to his weathered face as he spoke. "Well done, Mr. Carter," he said sarcastically. "I must commend your journalistic skills. You are indeed a hack of the first order. And so, my big secret has been revealed. But you see, Carter, it doesn't fucking matter. Seth Peterson died a long time ago. But Mandrake still lives, and I'll keep fighting until my dying breath." "Great speech," I replied mockingly, "but I'm not going to be your mouthpiece any longer. I'm done with this story, and I'm going home." I'd finally stood up to the feared Mandrake and felt some degree of satisfaction in that moment. But unfortunately it did not last. The vigilante boss didn't react well to my defiance, as he pointed his machine pistol towards me and spoke through clenched teeth. "I'm not done with you yet, Carter. We still have work to do, and I can't let you go." He motioned the gun towards the far end of the office floor. "There's a service elevator over there, still functional. We're all going to leave here together." I was horrified, realizing that I'd gone from interviewer to hostage in mere seconds. I looked to Fence in that moment. He'd remained silent throughout my argument with Mandrake, and the look in his eyes told me he wasn't happy. Nevertheless, the time-traveling vigilante offered me no support as he walked towards the waiting lift without comment. And I was forced to follow him, with the gun-wielding Mandrake pushing me forwards with the barrel of his pistol poking into my back. We got into the creaky elevator and descended. The tension inside of that tight space was unbearable, as a cold sweat poured down my brow. Mandrake kept a close watch on me throughout our short descent, a killer's glint in his dark eyes. Was he going to kill me? It seemed like a distinct possibility. My mind raced as the survival instinct kicked in, and I considered attempting a desperate escape. But the dynamics of our situation changed rapidly once our elevator reached the ground floor and the doors pinged open. Looking out, we saw a figure waiting for us outside of the lift door, armed and pointing his gun towards us. It took me a second to recognize the grizzled face of the trench coat-wearing gunman. It was Hennessy, the PD-turned-bounty hunter who'd been on Mandrake's trail from the very beginning. And finally he'd found him. It seemed like the world froze for a tension-filled moment. But then everything happened at once. As the game of cat and mouse reached its bloody conclusion. Bang! Hennessy fired first, with a single bullet striking Mandrake in the chest. The vigilante fell backwards, mortally wounded, but with his last ounce of strength. He pulled the trigger on his gun, unleashing a burst of automatic gunfire which almost cut the bounty hunter in half. Hennessy was killed instantly, while Mandrake slumped against the elevator wall, blood pouring from his wound as he looked up at me and spluttered out his final words. "Write my story, Carter. Preserve my legacy," he whispered faintly, and then the notorious vigilante leader shut his eyes and stopped breathing. I was in a state of shock after watching the violence play out. Part of me was glad Mandrake was dead, but I couldn't help but think he'd avoided justice. He got what he wanted, I said solemnly. Died a martyr to his cause. I'd almost forgotten that Fence was present, as he remained silent for some time. But suddenly I heard him tutting behind me, as he said, "No sir. That won't do." I turned to Fence in surprise, wondering what he meant, but then I remembered his hidden power. Fence stepped over Mandrake's corpse, instead walking over to Hennessy's body before touching him gently on his forehead. There followed a flash of light which temporarily blinded me, and when my sight was restored, the scene before me had changed dramatically. I don't know what action Fence took in the past before he was thrust back to our present. But Hennessy's body was no longer present, and Mandrake was no longer dead. The resurrected vigilante leader struggled upon shaking legs, seemingly confused and disorientated as he stumbled out of the elevator, muttering to himself as he went. "No, this can't be. This isn't right," he said. Suddenly there were loud footsteps on the floor as new figures emerged from the shadows. "Freeze, asshole. Don't you move." It was a cop, running straight towards the baffled Mandrake. The vigilante's gun was still lying on the elevator floor, and for once he was taken off guard. The officer opened fire, but with a taser rather than a gun. Mandrake was hit in the chest, his body convulsing as the volts surged through him. A second later and another cop appeared, tackling Mandrake down to the ground and securing him in handcuffs. More officers charged towards us, shouting with guns drawn. Both Fence and I surrendered without a fight. And finally the ordeal was over. And that's my story, in its entirety. I was released without charge, but my companions were caught bang to rights. The charge list against Mandrake is the length of a novel, and he'll surely spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. As for Fence, he made a full confession and has been charged with 2 counts of murder, both committed before the killer was officially born. Another legal first. I'll admit that I was in 2 minds over whether to publish this story. I no longer care about acclaim, praise, or awards, and I do fear that I'm still doing Mandrake's bidding by spreading his infamy. But in the end, I decided this is a story which must be told, if only to allow this war-torn city to heal. I won't make any moral judgment here. Such lofty ideals seem hollow now, given all the bloodshed and suffering I've witnessed. But I will finish this article with a genuine plea for peace, and a hope that, one day, true justice will be served. The bright yellow terror down there in the water. I saw several glimpses of bright yellow popping up from and then retreating down below the surface, only to pop up again in a rhythmic fashion, like a dance routine. Brightly yellow and deadly. Are they mocking us? The rotting, sweet stench of death is still lodged in my nostrils. We are trapped here, and people are losing their minds. I had found these diary pages while digging through old boxes in my basement. My wife had insisted, finally, that I sort out and get rid of everything I didn't need. Now here I was, directly confronted with a part of my past I had tried to suppress unsuccessfully for so many years. 24 years to be exact. 24 odd years of trying to understand what exactly happened in those days on a rooftop in Phuket during a horrifying natural disaster. 24 odd years of having to dodge questions of my unwavering fear of the ocean. Well, in truth, I guess being caught in a large tsunami and witnessing the immense destructive forces of nature coming directly from the great wide ocean would be a fair excuse. But it was only half the truth. It wasn't just the waves themselves that had terrified me. Someone once told me that writing can be therapeutic. Simply putting your thoughts down on paper, or in our times, more likely in a Word document, can help you compartmentalize trauma. So, I'm giving it a try. I often think of the beach days I missed with my son when he was a boy. Days where I should have done dad stuff. Like throwing him into the ocean. Watching him laugh his little face off as he braved the waves. Helping him build sandcastles, wrestle with him in the water. Gone exploring along the sandy shores in search of beach treasure. I just couldn't. Initially, I had objected to the idea of him going at all. Naturally, my wife would hear none of that, and I realized reluctantly that my fear and trauma should not rule my son's life. Instead, my wife would go, and I would always stay home. She understood, to some degree, what I had gone through and where my fear came from. Only to some degree. My son did not, and I sense he resented my absence on those perfect sunny days. Much to my despair, he turned out to be quite a little water enthusiast. I know for a fact that both he and my wife noticed how closed off I was about certain parts of my past. Secrets untold, especially those that are grounded in trauma, almost inevitably turn toxic in our systems. This story is about the strange and horrifying occurrences I experienced during a tsunami in Thailand. I don't have a truly rational explanation for what I went through. What I saw, all I know is this: there was something in the water. Something deeply, deeply unnatural. Something bright and oddly yellow. Something very deadly and evil. I have no other words for it than the bright yellow terror. I had traveled to Thailand around Christmas 2000. I had just turned 19 and I was on one of those infamous and increasingly popular self-discovery trips. Like so many other hopeful young adventurers at the time, I saw The Beach. I read Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. I watched DiCaprio walk the sandy shores of paradise until it wasn't paradise anymore, and read on in excitement and awe as Christopher McCandless set out to become one with nature and discover himself. Kill the false being within. In simple terms, I thought I'd try and find my own slice of heaven on earth. Expand my horizon, get to know some new people, learn something about myself in the process perhaps. I wasn't exactly fleeing from anything. That wasn't it. I had a loving, although overprotective family. Well, maybe I was fleeing from that if I'm being honest now. Advertisement, yes, I admit it. My parents had paved the way for me at almost every step. Made sure I got into the right schools. Made sure I never needed money. I guess I got tired of feeling dependent on them. I stopped taking their money. Worked my ass off, and saved up for the trip myself. It was time I stepped up. It was time I threw myself into the world to see what would happen. I felt I needed to get away from the safety of family, of home, of everything familiar, to truly discover myself, in uncharted territory. Hell of a time and place I picked. The following story is based on the surviving pages of the diary I kept during the time in my memory. Bangkok, the 23rd of December 2000. 4 days before the tsunami. Advertisement. You could probably imagine the excitement bubbling within me. For the first time on my own. In the prime of my life. In a strangely new and exotic city. Possibilities seemed endless. I still remember driving off from the airport with the wind in my hair in a tuk-tuk as Bangkok unfolded before me with all its oriental mysticism and surrounding cityscapes. I got myself stationed in a decent guest house around Khao San Road. Everywhere I looked it seemed others had gotten the same idea as me. Backpackers crowded the streets, and strangely, I felt at home amidst this quiet and peaceful chaos. Amidst the crowds of hopefully like-minded explorers. Far, far away from home, Khao San Road was perfect for me. A meeting place for young backpackers. With tons of opportunities to plan further travels. I did, after all, not plan on staying in Bangkok for too long. It was just a stepping point to other adventures. Advertisement. It was still early. I was in the mood to socialize, and with no real plans I simply ventured out into the streets of Bangkok. Circling the area where my guest house was located, It wasn't long before the first opportunity presented itself in the form of a taxi driver calling me over. He offered to take me on a tour of the city. Foolish and naive as I was, I indulged him. I remember how he lit up a doobie, joint, spliff, devil's lettuce, whatever you want to call it. You know it as soon as you breathe it in. Don't get me wrong, I partook myself from time to time. But letting a high person drive me around the busy Bangkok traffic did not seem like a good idea. I do remember feeling worried about what kind of person I had just so carelessly chosen to accompany. I was eventually led to a store, fitted for a suit I didn't want, and then subsequently charged an obscene amount for the cab ride. I didn't dare to refuse his unreasonable demand. Noteworthy mention. That same night I heard from a fellow traveler that just recently someone had been stabbed in an argument with a cab driver. I didn't let it get me down or drive me off course because, as you've probably gathered by now, I didn't have a course. As day turned to night and when the sun's rays slowly disappeared behind the rooftops of Bangkok, the city itself began to transform, as if a part of it that had laid dormant, hidden away from the light, started to emerge. I saw neon lights advertising different bars, and locals making all kinds of promises of untold pleasures and sensations. I saw tourists ready to party. All now filled the streets. Some seemed all too aware of what they were looking for. Others simply drifted around aimlessly, in search of something unknown, something to spice up their existence. I found a small, seemingly cool place called The Hangover. I swear to God, I wish to this day I hadn't. Maybe then I wouldn't have set my course for Phuket. In any case, I went in and pushed myself through the crowds of rowdy and loud tourists and up to the bar where I ordered a piña colada because why not? Standing at the crowded bar and looking around, hoping something interesting would catch my eye. But most of all, I was hoping someone would just take the first step and come talk to me. Advertisement someone did. His name was Robert, and he was from Australia. A tall, skinny and no-nonsense older guy in his late 40s who seemed quite experienced with all things Thailand. He eventually invited me down to his group of friends at the far back end of the bar. Robert spared no time telling me about himself. He had worked all kinds of jobs, in all kinds of places. Most recently he had worked as a guide in Phuket. Among other things, he had arranged rock climbing expeditions. I probably forgot to mention, I was big into rock climbing and generally all kinds of outdoor activities back then. I already had quite the climbing experience despite my young age. As Robert talked about all the places he'd been, he made me feel like the novice I was. That was never his intention though. As I quickly learned, he wasn't a braggart. He just knew what he was talking about, and when he laughed, he did it with his entire face and in a way that made you laugh with him and feel comfortable. Advertisement eventually. The conversation naturally gravitated towards Australia, a place I had always wanted to visit. He looked at me for a second, as if to contemplate something. Then he told me to watch out for locals trying to play pranks on me if I ever decided to go. I was naturally interested in hearing more, and that's when he told me about drop bears. Supposedly drop bears are carnivorous versions of koalas residing in trees that would then drop down on unsuspecting victims and viciously attack them. We laughed quite a lot, and I admitted I would probably have believed the stories as I was a fairly naive person and the idea of a hostile subspecies of koalas didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Our conversation then shifted toward Australian wildlife and fauna and the horrors residing within its diverse and complicated ecosystem. He told me about a plant not uncommonly referred to as the suicide plant. It has such a nasty sting it made a man commit suicide simply to escape the pain. Another dangerous inhabitant was the box jellyfish, he explained. Their sting is about as deadly as it gets. A single sting will cause necrosis of the skin, excruciating pain, and, if the dose of venom is large enough, cardiac arrest and death within minutes. I found the thought of the box jellyfish equal parts fascinating and equal parts frightening. Beautiful but deadly creatures. In fact, the ocean, in all its grand wide-reaching glory, had always made me uncomfortable to some extent. So much unexplored space. Who truly knows what could be lurking down there? Robert quickly assured me that as long as you take your precaution, the likelihood of getting stung by a box jellyfish was rather small. It was getting late, and before we said our goodbyes, Robert suggested I meet him in Phuket. More precisely in the Karen area on the 28th, as that was the first day he would be able to meet. I agreed. He seemed genuinely nice and knowledgeable. Just good company all around, and he promised to show me the greatest climbing spots a bit away from the crowded tours. I would never meet Robert again. I don't know what happened to him. Thinking back on those days leading up to the point where the waves came crashing down always gives me an uneasy, sad, and melancholic feeling. I woke up with a slight hangover. Christmas is commonly celebrated on this date in my country, so I was expecting some calls to go through on my brick-sized Nokia at some point once all the good folks back home woke up. They were about 5 hours behind me, and at 9 a.m. Bangkok time they would still be sleeping. I used the time to do some shopping before my trip to Phuket. I got plenty of rope, a couple of snap hooks, and a harness. I knew they'd have all of this on the guided tours, but I liked to find my own spots to climb, and I had good sense and knowledge enough to not attempt anything too daring. After having done my shopping, I bought a bus ticket to Phuket intending to leave that same night. As exciting as Bangkok was, I felt it was more for people intending to party, and honestly, it was a bit too crowded for me. I was excited to move on. Advertisement on the way into the reception area of my guest house. I was stopped by a young-looking and hip dude asking me for a cigarette. He had sort of a rugged look. Dirty blonde, half-long hair. His face I would best describe as boyish, but something in his eyes betrayed him and revealed his age to be older than you would assume. His style was bohème. I guess I would describe it as like something taken out of the 70s LA scene. Now I don't necessarily consider myself a perfect judge of character, but he had an easygoing way about him that immediately drew me in. Sometimes, you can just tell. I'm not a smoker, never was, so I couldn't help him on that front. No worries, I'll find him somewhere else, he said. For a while, we just casually talked. He had come to Bangkok from India just a few days prior and seemed about as lost and without direction as I had been before deciding to take my chances in Phuket. Alex was his name, and he would later teach me a painful lesson about what mistakes, hurt and loss can do to a person, but I'm getting ahead of myself. He asked me if I wanted to go somewhere and get a beer. I thought, why not? He was around my age, I guessed, and on his own as well. I told him I had to go make some calls and I'd be out in about an hour. Back in the hotel room, I quickly gathered all my stuff and packed it up. So it was ready to go. My climbing gear took up the most space. I figured if things went well with Alex, I might ask him to join me at some point in Phuket. Even though I had set out for this trip to be about discovering myself and being on my own, I longed for some kind of company. Don't we all? I called my parents up and we wished each other a happy Christmas. It was odd to think they were somewhere nearly halfway across the world celebrating Christmas while snow draped the landscapes there. Here I was, in a hot and humid paradise. It was the usual song and dance I got from them. Are you safe? Don't go to this place. I heard bad things. Don't do this. You might get in trouble. Yada yada yada. This was one thing I didn't miss, and it reminded me I had made the right choice to travel away from the clamoring clutches of my perpetually worried parents. Advertisement. My 5-year-old nephew somehow got hold of the phone. Not quite a conversationalist yet, but it still felt good to hear his voice. Hearing his excitement over the prospect of celebrating Christmas brought me back to my own childhood. Decorating the Christmas tree, watching holiday cartoons, and of course, opening presents. I finished my calls and went out to see if Alex was ready. He was already waiting for me and had managed to score some cigarettes in the meantime. He had changed his outfit as well. He was now wearing a faded black Doors t-shirt. We talked a bit about Jim Morrison and the Doors as we headed off down streets. We passed a myriad of small stands selling everything from electronics to colorful t-shirts and small bracelets with campy misspelled English catchphrases. We dodged the many intrusive offers and eventually found a small comfy-looking bar with seats outside shaded by palm trees. Then we ordered a couple of beers, and soon the conversation started flowing. As it turned out, Alex was 27, so he was a bit older than I had initially guessed. We learned that we had a common interest in music. For a while, he had busked as a street musician while working odd jobs here and there and had eventually decided to travel the world. His latest stop had been India, where for a while he had lived on the rooftop of some abandoned building while attempting to learn the art of playing the sitar. I thought about that for a second. Living it rough on a rooftop in India. I don't know why that idea intrigued me so much. It seemed like freedom to me, I suppose. sleeping under the wide open skies, looking down on the busy streets and watching people go about their lives. I guess I just liked the idea of doing something that seemed different from what I had ever done before. Living on a rooftop, if even just for a while, was definitely not something I had done before. We drifted off into long conversations about music I won't bore you with. Only to let you know we shared a passion for old school music like The Doors and Jimi Hendrix, as well as 90s shoegaze music like My Bloody Valentine, Ride, and Slow Dive. I had Slow Dive's Shine playing in my mind that day. It all felt so dreamy at the time. I eventually told Alex of my plans to go to Phuket and he was on board almost immediately. I loved how easy it was here on the road. There was no, well maybe, or, let's think about it. Alex had been to Phuket before and knew of a place we could stay for free. Another rooftop of course, but he had already sold me on the idea. From there, we could plan our next step. He said, our next step, I don't remember vibing with someone that quickly before or since. But then I guess making friends is always easier when you're young and easygoing. I always seemed to attract good company without much effort back then. I chalk it down to my friendly and slightly shy demeanor. Seems it only becomes harder to make friends as the years pass though. At least it did for me. We got a bus ticket for Alex and went shopping. I got some first aid supplies. Bandages, band-aids, painkillers, that kind of stuff. Rock climbing is safe if you know what you are doing. Mind you, but you can end up scraping yourself, and I felt in general being prepared for whatever might be a good idea if I was to live it rough on some rooftop. Advertisement. The bus ride to Phuket took about 12 hours give or take. By going at night, we could sleep most of the way and be in Phuket in the morning on the 25th. The trip down was unsurprisingly uneventful. We would take turns listening to music on Alex's Walkman or talk about things we saw along the way. Like roadside bars and restaurants which were little more than a tin roof covering a few plastic chairs and brightly colored menu cards plastered on the side of a shed. Everything in the Thai countryside seemed simpler, in the best ways possible. No big flash, no fanfares or luxury, nothing pretentious, just a calm, laid-back atmosphere and friendly smiles from the locals as we passed by. Alex told me he wanted to start a band blending elements of shoegaze, dream pop with classic rock and insisted I learn to play the drums. He had tried but found no luck. String instruments were more his thing, he told me. I told him jokingly if he could come up with a good name, I might be down. He just nodded, looked out the window, and started talking about how beef was a rare and more expensive ingredient in Thai cuisine. And I wondered about the sudden random change of subject. There was an undeniable air of mystery over him. Judging from all the things he told me, he seemed like a person who dreamed big, but never really followed through. An unfinished education, scribbles on pieces of paper that ended up gathering dust in his drawer instead of turning into a book. A band that never really took off because he lost interest or didn't deem that it was good enough to be successful. Moving from place to place and never committing to any of them. He talked at length about leaving a legacy. It seemed to be something that concerned him. I guess he wanted to put his mark on the world. To be remembered. To prove himself somehow. I had never really thought about it myself, although I did have a fascination with historical people and the lives they lived. In fact, when I do read, I mostly read biographies. I just never had any ambition like that myself. I tried to ask Alex about his family and friends back home. He told me bits here and there, but I couldn't help but feel there was something he was leaving out. Especially family seemed to be a touchy subject. At certain points, I sensed a carefully hidden sadness behind his optimistically youthful and bright blue gaze. Phuket, 25th of December 2000. 2 days before the tsunami. Alex woke me up. It was 9 a.m. and we had arrived at the Phuket Bus Terminal 1 near Phang Na Road. He explained to me that there were several derelict and abandoned buildings perfect for establishing a free-of-charge rooftop domicile in an area not too far from the resorts of Khao Lak. Phuket back then wasn't exactly the overcrowded tourist spot it is today. But it was well on the way. I understood why. The scenery was beautiful. Long sandy beaches with small islands dotting the horizon, begging to be explored. Giant limestone cliffs covered in green shrubs rose up from the ocean. I was sold. We found the area Alex had talked about. Several derelict buildings were concentrated in a small area divided by a main street that if followed long enough led to an area with shops and places to dine. We set our eyes on what looked like an abandoned apartment complex. It was rugged looking and had clearly seen better days. Its ghostly exterior facade begged us inside to explore, and we accepted the invitation. As we made our way in through a busted window in the back, we quickly became aware that the place might not be as abandoned as we had initially thought. Several signs of squatters, such as cooking utensils and sleeping mats, lay scattered here and there. Alex rationalized that it could just be other backpackers. I shrugged, and we decided to make our way to the roof. We got up to the top floor and accessed a broken-down door that led directly out onto the roof. I must admit, despite my excitement, I was somewhat hesitant. Any doubt I had disappeared when we first stepped onto the rooftop. It was perfect. It seemed it had functioned as a common area of sorts the inhabitants could make use of for gatherings. The roof was surrounded by an iron fence. Several palm trees cast shades over the northwest corner, which was perfect for when things got too hot. In the middle, a small janitorial sort of shed stood. We found some cleaning materials, brooms, some parasols in there, as well as an old rusty grill and a couple of wooden chairs. The view from the roof was amazing. We could see the large beachfront in the far distance, surrounded by limestone cliffs. After inspecting the area and finding it to our liking, we sat down. Alex took out a bottle of whiskey, unaware of the horror that would later unfold here. We celebrated in the shade of the palm trees. We had found our place for a while. After a while, we decided to put some money into the local economy and shop for supplies. Essentials: water, fruit, cigarettes for Alex, booze, the devil's lettuce, cooking utensils, although as it turned out none of us were admittedly much of a cook. But what the hell, can't be seen dining out every night when we were trying to live off the fat of the land, so to speak. I know, ridiculous. We were squatters, nothing more, but heck, we would move on if we became a problem for anyone here. We weren't trying to be a bother. Optional but greatly wanted. A blow-up animal mascot. Maybe a dolphin if possible. Some new music for Alex's Walkman. A guitar. Decorating artifacts of any kind to make our domicile more personal. We more or less got everything we needed and started setting up the base. Getting our hands on something funny to smoke proved the biggest challenge, but Alex finally succeeded at a beachfront bar. Some friendly Norwegian dude who had connections apparently. He warned us against being too open about doing drugs, even if it was just weed. Thailand has a strict approach to drugs. We thanked him, and he told us to just come back here to the bar if we needed more. The afternoon was rolling around, and there we were, sitting atop Phuket, in our very own rooftop presidential suite. We decorated the place with a few things we found. Among them was art, our blow-up shark. They had no dolphins. Alex had come up with the name. I asked him, why art? However, in what I had quickly come to know as typical Alex fashion, he just shrugged it off. Just like the name is all. We smoked a bit and drank some booze as the evening progressed, and I told Alex about Robert, Australia, and all the nasty things that could kill you there. I'm not sure why, but it made an impression on me. Insects, poisonous creatures, and stuff like that were nightmare fuel for me. Don't even get me started on spiders. Alex was more laid back on that front. He seemed most amused and interested in the suicide plan, and wondered if some poor soul had ever mistakenly tried to use it as toilet paper in a sticky situation, and we had a good hard chuckle over that idea. Poor soul indeed. As night rolled on, stars started popping up on a clear night sky, and I learned that Alex had a fascination with the universe. Particularly the idea of multiverses and infinite universes. What if somewhere out there we were looking back at ourselves? Different but still somehow us? He asked me as we looked upon the starry night sky. It seemed to me part of him always longed to be anywhere else but where he was. Maybe in the past he was so reluctant to share with me. Then we started talking about time. I don't exactly remember why. I think he brought it up. Anyway, Alex had a lot to say about time. Like how he believed our perception of time is tied to our experiences. For example, someone who spends their life not stepping up, not really taking risks or chances, just following along the stream, just following the routine, in essence, just killing time, might experience time as having moved fast when they look back. Because there are simply less variety, less volume, fewer memories that stand out to look back on. We don't remember routines. We remember breaking them. We remember doing new things, meeting new people, and being in new places. It creates the illusion and gives time volume, making it seem fuller and longer. I liked that idea a lot. It made sense to me. Make sure you live life to the fullest and waste as little time as possible. I told him about my 10th grade math teacher and how he said something about time I will never forget. Our perception of time can be measured mathematically. For example, to a 4-year-old turning 5, the transition of a year will seem much longer than it will to a 24-year-old turning 25. Because 1 in 5 is a larger fraction than 1 in 25. It blew my mind. The longer you live, the faster time seems to pass. But I agreed with him. Maybe the quality and variety of the lives we live and the memories we make influence our perception of time too. Alex made a boom sound and motioned with his hands around his head. We both started laughing. We were quite stoned at that point, and well, some of you might know how being stoned sometimes throws you into these philosophical conversations. It was nice. I enjoyed the ease with which I could talk to Alex about all kinds of things, even if some things were off limit. At one point I asked him a hypothetical. If he could go back in time and change just one thing, what would he change? He fell silent. I once again sensed the sadness creeping behind his eyes. It was as if he was about to answer, like he was sizing me up, but then his face changed, and he shot the idea down. Time travel is impossible, so why bother, was his only response. And I accepted that whatever troubled him in the past was not for me to know. Even if my interest only grew stronger and stronger. I told him about my family, my overprotective mother, my father and his desperate attempts to get me interested in cars, about my older sister and my silly nephew. Alex nodded and asked the usual polite questions. When the subject landed on my little brother, his interest seemed to spark significantly. How old was he? Was I a good older brother? Did I look out for him? I told him in all honesty that I found my little brother of 10 years to be a pain in the ass with his constant intrusion and clinginess. Alex shot me a look that made me feel like I had said something blasphemous and unspeakable. He seemed to then contain himself, looked down, and simply said, "Don't take your family for granted." I found it odd at the time, but seeing as many things about Alex seemed off or odd, I just chalked it down as one more quirk. When we finally settled in the night, I slipped into an old familiar nightmare. It was the same I had had years earlier when I was 16. It always seemed to reappear whenever I found myself in unfamiliar territory. I was lying in my bed, paralyzed, on my side, facing the door to my room. I often had the light turned on outside of my bedroom and it would shine in through the open door. I saw a dark silhouette approaching through the door opening. Optimistically, I assumed it was my mom, coming to wake me up. However, as the dark figure slowly came closer, I quickly realized this wasn't so. Something was off. Even though it was nothing but a silhouette backlit by the light coming from outside my bedroom, I knew this was something else. I could sense it. The dark figure uttered no words as it slowly walked towards me. My heart started racing, and before long it was right by my bedside. It sat down and I realized it was an old woman or man. It was hard to tell because its face was just a mishmash of wrinkled flesh. It mumbled through its mouthless face, speaking in tongues. It wasn't physically aggressive, but it seemed angry, like it was just casually cursing me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out as I desperately tried to wiggle and will myself to wake up as I had sometimes done before. Back when I was 16 and first had these nightmares, I had just started in a new school, coming from having been in the same class with the same kids for 9 years. I guess the sudden change into something new and the stress related to that caused me to have these frequent bouts of sleep paralysis and nightmares. I would always wake up, drenched in sweat. Back then though, I had been in my room. And in the dream, my room had stood clearly for me as it looked like in reality, which only made the whole thing seem more real. This time I woke up on the rooftop next to Alex. Still drenched in sweat, I had screamed in my sleep. He comforted me in an almost brotherly show of affection, and we talked for a while. I appreciated his efforts, but reliving that old nightmare had shaken me up. It had always seemed like a bad omen. Phuket, 26th of December 2000. One day before the tsunami. The day started calmly. We were sitting in the shade of the palm trees that stretched across the rooftop. Alex made me forget about my nightmare from the day before by writing possibly the dumbest song about it ever. I guess I should have been slightly insulted that he would take a private horrifying experience I had gone through and turn it into a lewd joke about a rapey succubus entity invading my teenage bedroom, but damn it, the guy was funny. I couldn't help but laugh, and I knew he only did it to cheer me up. I had found an old wooden chair in the utility shed and was drumming along on it as he played. We discussed band names, and after Alex told me about his weird, wonderful, and at times creepy experience of sleeping down on the London subway, I knew Subway Sleepers was the perfect name for a shoegaze, dream pop, classic rock fusion band. We decided on a plan for the day that involved getting me some actual percussion instruments, more weed, and a trip to the beach. We would need to go to the beach bar to visit the Norwegian weed dude anyway. His name was Thor, and he did have his part to play in this story, so I guess I might as well stop calling him Norwegian weed dude. Thor was sure enough just where we found him the last time, wearing a kitschy flowery Hawaii shirt. We went a bit away from the crowds to conduct our business, and soon we had a pretty neat supply that would last us some time. Thor told us to look out for people trying to lure us into a trap. Apparently, some dealers were working with the local police. They'd get unsuspecting tourists to buy drugs from them. And what do you know? Around the corner, a couple of police officers would be waiting to strike, and as mentioned earlier, drug possession in Thailand is no joke. The option you were left with was to pay up or get stationed in a cell in one of those dreaded Thai prisons you probably wouldn't last a week in. Maybe he was just trying to make sure he didn't lose our business. But he seemed quite serious. Anyway, we thanked him for the advice, and Alex invited him up to the rooftop for a party later that evening and told him he could bring some friends along if he wanted to. Alex gave him our word we would stop by and pick him up and anyone he wanted to bring along after we had been to the beach. So we're throwing a party, I asked Alex as we walked along the beach on a small sandy road surrounded by jungle-like vegetation. Hell yeah, why not? Was his response. Not that I minded. We need to go shopping then. No booze left. We gotta be good hosts. He agreed, as we walked out from under the palm trees and entered the beach. I just stopped for a moment, looked around, and took it all in. Sand and ocean as far as the eye could see. Small islands in the distance. Alex patted me on the back and asked me if I could swim, in kind of a serious tone that caught me off guard. I wondered what kind of question that was. Of course, I could. We ran out into the waves and threw ourselves in. I went under and up again. Alex was gone. I looked around for a while in utter confusion. He was simply gone. Nowhere to be seen. Suddenly I felt something tug at my legs. Before I knew it, I was pulled under. When I re-emerged, Alex was laughing at me. I lunged at him, and before long we were wrestling around in the waves like a couple of kids peeking on sugar. At one point Alex dragged me along like a rag doll until I got the upper hand and swiped his legs away from under him. I used the moment to get some distance to contemplate my strategy. He had me in terms of size, but I was faster. When he came for me a second time, I quickly dodged him and went for his legs again. We fooled around like that for maybe half an hour before we sat down on the beach, both panting and laughing like idiots. Alex tapped my shoulder and thanked me for being a good sport. I sensed he had needed that somehow. His eyes lit up like a Christmas tree, and I think I saw glimpses of genuine childlike happiness. Haven't played like that in the ocean since I was a kid. The way he said it was odd, as if he was about to say something else. Stop, and then went with the kid line. I just said, you never get too old to play in the ocean, and he agreed with a small tempered nod. Come to think of it now, that was the last time I went to the beach. The next couple of hours we just walked along the shore and left our footprints in the sand. When we got bored, we headed back to the beach bar to see if Thor was ready to go. In the meantime, he had gotten company. If I had known that I would be trapped in hell on earth with these people, I might have screened them a bit more. Hindsight is 20/20, right? There were two chicks from Spain Thor had picked up at a bar in Bangkok some weeks prior. A guy from Italy the others simply called Franco immediately gave me an odd and chilling vibe. Something about the look in his eyes. The last dude named Matt was from Canada and was seemingly someone the others had just met that same day. We all headed to the stores to buy supplies. Plenty of booze, plastic cups, snacks. Alex and I promised a small live concert with our shitty half-finished music, and the evening was said to be a success. I wish I could tell you in detail about the party we threw that night. I really do. I wish I could put off the inevitable just a little longer. But here's where my memory gets a bit fuzzy. I didn't usually get that drunk. But that night was an exception. The parts one do remember are this. Thor had brought a boombox, and I remember Born Slippy from the soundtrack of Trainspotting was blasting through the air in the hours before dusk as the sun was slowly setting. I remember Alex and me dancing like fools. I remember that we did give our improvised concert, which we should probably have started with before we got drunk. I remember Thor trying to get with one of the chicks he had brought along and got brutally rejected. I remember Franco and Matt getting into some kind of argument. I remember the sunset over Phuket. I remember nothing else really from that night. I woke up with quite a hangover. The first thing I thought of was water. I needed water. I found a half-full bottle and downed it all in one go. I looked around and noticed the two chicks from Spain had left. Thor, Franco, Matt, and Alex lay scattered around the rooftop in various spots of shade. I checked the time. Around 11 a.m. I sat down in one of the chairs to relax and take in the view of Phuket bathed in the midday sun. About an hour or so later, just as I was contemplating waking up Alex, I heard a sudden, most terrifying, and deafening sound, like an airplane taking off right next to me. That's how I remember it. Faint and distant sounds of tourists chattering amongst themselves, like a quiet bridge in a song before the chorus hits. Then everything came crashing down. As I turned to look towards the sound, I struggled to understand what I saw. It came from the beach. Waves higher than I had ever seen before came rolling, and people were running away. From a distance, they looked like ants scattering in all directions. The first wave hit with a thundering crash, and I saw how trees, houses, and people were swept away violently. One instant it was all there. The next, just gone. It was all so violent and sudden, like being woken up with a fist to the face. The others were up by then, and Alex came running over to my side as I stood in complete disbelief at what I saw. Soon all the water and debris were rushing by below the apartment complex we were standing on, and before long, the water was up to a few meters below the rooftop. People began floating by. Alex and I looked helplessly on as they were dragged along with the stream. The others had gathered around us now, and Thor was the first who spoke. What the fuck happened? My voice was shaking as I told him what I had seen. Just then another wave came crashing down, bigger than the one before. We all took a step back. We need to get the hell away from here, Thor said, and I just gestured down on the rushing water and debris below. He looked frightened. Matt, who was unbelievably cool-headed given the situation, calmed him down. Alex pointed towards the water below us, and I saw immediately what he was gesturing at. A man was clinging on for dear life to the side of a balcony belonging to the building opposite from us. It looked like he was losing his grip. He looked over at us with a begging look in his eyes, and my heart sank. Then I remembered the climbing gear I had in my backpack. I quickly rushed over and got the rope, fastened it to the metal fence on the rooftop, and threw the other end over to the man. He grabbed it firmly and wrapped it around his torso. I could see his muscles flexing, trying to hold on tight as Alex and I started to drag him towards us. With a struggle and some help from Matt, we managed to drag the man up until he could reach the metal fence and drag himself over. He rolled onto the rooftop, exhausted, banged up, but alive. He was sobbing quietly. We quickly learned he had been to the beach with his family, a wife and young daughter. He told us his name was Thomas. Matt took him aside as Alex and I turned towards the rushing water below. More people came floating by, and some of them managed to grab on to various things. We quickly realized we had to do something. The roles seemed to naturally divide themselves. Alex and I started the rescue effort, and Matt, as well as Thor to some extent, would tend to the wounded and traumatized people. Franco was wandering around in a state of shock, talking to himself. It landed on Thor to try and calm him down. Alex and I managed to secure a rope between our rooftop and a balcony on the opposite of the street, as a man there had managed to drag himself up on it to tie the opposite end. That way I could use a rope, harness, and snap hook to improvise a zipline and swing across to catch people rushing by. To this day I have no idea how I managed to stay so practical and level-headed at that moment. But I suppose Alex's support was what helped me step up. He had kept insisting that we had to do something. We had to help in any way we could. His unwavering determination inspired me. We rescued a young boy. He was crying uncontrollably and yelling in Spanish, which neither I nor any of the others spoke. We only understood that his name was Eduardo. Hearing his despair and desperation tore right into my heart, but with adrenaline rushing and people still in need of help, I had to shut it off. Those initial hours, it was all about saving as many as we could. I had no time to process anything. As the day went along, we were working mechanically like robots. We didn't think about how some of the people we dragged up complained about being bitten by something. How some of them seemed off, confused, delirious. We were in the middle of a horrible natural disaster, so abnormal behavior seemed quite normal in that context. Initially, we assumed they must have cut themselves on tree branches or other debris as they were violently dragged along the water stream. It wasn't until one man came out of the water with something clinging to his leg that I realized something wasn't right. That was when it all changed. When everything became uncertain, surreal, like the beginning of a feverish nightmare. We had just dragged him up and he was screaming in pain. Then I noticed it. At first glance, it looked like a jellyfish. The umbrella or bell head of a jellyfish, for lack of a better way to put it, was nauseating. Transparent, and unnaturally bright yellow color, like taken out of a trippy cartoon. Its tentacles or strings were medium thick and wrapped around the man's leg in a death grip. Here is where it gets especially weird. Inside the yellow transparent umbrella was what looked like a skull. A small, oblong, and flat white, grayish-colored skull with eye sockets. A pair of small, mean and beady-looking eyes were located at the front of it. People with basic biological knowledge might note that jellyfish do not have skulls or any kind of bone structure. They are invertebrates, yet I don't have any other words to describe what I saw. The thing disgusted me beyond comprehension. Small strings shot out of the skull and withered around inside the jellied flesh of the umbrella. I ponder now whether those were transmitters of some kind, sending out signals. The man was screaming, loudly, for me to get it off his leg. I grabbed a broom we found in the shed and lodged it in between the creature and the man's leg. The thing was clinging on strongly. Another oddity. Jellyfish do not cling to people this way, nor do they possess any kind of muscle mass to hold on this tightly. I spent considerable effort trying to pry the thing off, and just when I thought I couldn't get any more disgusted, it let out a bone-piercing high-pitched shriek just as I finally managed to pry it off. The sound was like dental drills on teeth, but much louder and eerily mixed with a second much deeper pitch like a distorted bass. It landed upside down on the rooftop, and that's when I noticed where the sound came from. Beneath the umbrella was a small circular mouth. For lack of a better word, this thing defied logic, so I'm trying to find terms as close to our understanding of physiology as I can. Its mouth was lined with small sharp teeth, bloodied from having feasted on the poor guy's leg. It was opening and closing in quick succession while letting out that horrible sound. After a while, it fell silent. I stepped back in absolute horror. Alex approached and I instinctively grabbed him and held him back before he could step any closer. I improvised a grid around the thing using chairs and informed everyone to stay away from it. When faced with something you don't understand, something unknown, caution is necessary. The others gathered around the creature and looked at it in amazement. I told them all to keep their distance. Matt and I managed to drag the guy who had been bitten into the shade of the palm trees. That's where we improvised a section for the injured. I asked him how he was feeling, and he told me he had a strong stinging and painful sensation in his leg. He was feverish too. I did not have much to offer him except for the over-the-counter painkillers I had in my first aid kit. He gobbled it down, and I asked Matt and the others to look after him as I went back to scout for more survivors in need of help. By the end of the day, we had managed to get 17 people to safety. Many more had rushed by and been dragged along towards an unknown fate before we could get to them. I remember a young girl, maybe about 14, rushing by as I was pulling up an elderly woman. The look on her face is one I will never forget. About 6 of the people we got out of the water complained of being bitten by something and were showing initial symptoms of some kind of sickness. Which unimaginable horror and cruelty would only become truly apparent to us later. As the sun was setting on a day that had changed us all, Alex and I were resting from sheer exhaustion. Our muscles ached all over from the day's ordeal. Matt came over with a worried look on his face. And even though I had just met the guy, I got the impression that if something had gotten to him, it had to be bad. He told Alex and me that several of the people were getting worse and worse. Increasing delirium, fever, aching joints. Some had complained that it felt like their bones were on fire. Whatever that was supposed to mean, I told him we could do nothing to help them beyond painkillers, bandages, and cleaning wounds until the water subsided and rescue teams had been dispatched. I was sure help was on the way. As it turned out, I was wrong. What I didn't know at that point was that due to unforeseen logistics, the rescue efforts had been delayed in our area. At least, that's the official explanation. I now believe they were stalling, trying to contain us, quarantine us, awaiting orders on how to proceed. Advertisement. Matt looked worried and then sat down next to me. That thing on the man's leg, you don't suppose it's poisonous? There could be more of them in the water. I had to admit at that point I had thought about it myself. It was partly why I was worried about going into the water. Besides, the water had stopped rushing by. There were no more people in immediate need of help. The area was flooded, but I figured the water would eventually reside. I told him it was best to stay on the roof for now, and he agreed and left to check on the injured and sick. I chatted with Alex for an hour or so and made sure he was okay, and then decided to check up on the situation myself. I wanted to see exactly what we were dealing with. As I came closer to the section under the palm trees where the makeshift hospital was located, I noticed a foul stench faintly resting in the still hot and humid night air. A rotten smell mixed with a fruity sweet scent. I covered my nose with my shirt, and as I approached, the stench got almost unbearable. I sat down beside Matt and the man I had pried that yellow creature off of. I realized to my horror the stench was coming from him. He was sweating, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. However, that wasn't the worst part. He looked like parts of his body were imploding on itself, as if his bones were deteriorating. Matt turned to me and asked me if I'd ever seen anything like this before. I just shook my head in silent horror. As I came closer, the man reached out for me, and for a second, I flinched and retreated backward. It wasn't fair, but he scared me a lot. I felt like a child again watching his first horror movie. The first real scare. It was a primal, bone-chilling fear. He looked ghoulish, as if his face was sinking in on itself, like he was decomposing from the inside out. He was barely able to speak any higher than a faint whisper. I couldn't hear him. I know I should have been more careful. I had no idea if whatever he was inflicted with was contagious. But I had an instinct that outweighed my fear. I wanted to help ease his pain in whatever way I could. So, I leaned in to listen. "Kill me," the faint, raspy voice commanded. "Kill me, please." Then it turned into an agonizing begging. A weak, raspy, agonizing begging. "Please, you must kill me." A chill went through my entire body, and I looked towards Matt. He just shook his head. I didn't even contemplate the thought at the time. How could I kill someone? Looking back now, I wish I had maned up and spared him what was to come. His eyes, looking like they were slowly sinking into his head, looked frightened, fixed on me, pleading with me to end his misery. I couldn't. After that, my curiosity got the best of me. I braved my fear of the unknown and went over to take another look at the yellow creature, making sure to keep my distance. To my surprise, it still seemed alive. However, only barely. It was just oddly vibrating and jittering. In the evening darkness, it glowed so brightly yellow my eyes almost hurt from looking at it, and I felt a headache coming on. There was something else too. I heard what seemed like an ocean of faintly whispering voices. Voices so low it was impossible to make any sense of it. They were just there, like a constant drone, like an ominous presence. A constant, silent background noise. It felt as if they were probing inside me somehow. Inside my mind, looking for something. Alex came to me later that night and pulled me aside. He needed to vent. So did I. It was as if the entire ordeal of the day came crashing down on me all at once. I hadn't allowed myself to feel much of anything, as it seemed I was constantly on high alert. But now, as the darkness had descended upon us, as there was nothing more that could be done for the day, it all came to me at once. I broke down. I felt so small all of a sudden. The tough, pragmatic facade I had put up fell apart. Alex placed his arm around me and told me it was all going to be alright. But I felt the doubt in his voice. He was scared. We all were. We may have survived the waves. But we had all seen that thing. We were all aware that we were trapped on a roof surrounded by people getting increasingly sicker and sicker. I had noticed the others talking amongst themselves, although only a few remarks during the chaos had been centered around that strange creature. I knew, somehow, it was occupying all our minds. We just sat there in silence for a while, trying to take in the day's events. I could see Matt in the distance attempting to calm down the sick. I heard their screams of anguish and tried my best to block it out. I spoke up after a while. Alex, I feel like I can trust you. I think I'm losing my mind. Ever since I saw that creature I've been hearing things. These voices, soft voices whispering. There are so many of them. I don't know. I must be going insane. Alex looked into my eyes. Fear radiating from his eyes. I hear them too. For me, it's not voices. At least not speaking a language I understand. It's more of a feeling. A strong feeling. I nodded in agreement. I remember feeling some relief that wasn't the only one hearing things. Not the only one sensing something. What do you think that creature? That yellow creature is? Alex looked up at the night sky. I'm not sure. Maybe some kind of deep-sea creature? I think it's messing with our heads. I had no idea how to respond. I felt lost. Doomed. Like my mind was slowly breaking down. Silence swept over us for a while. Alex shifted uncomfortably from side to side. You remind me of someone. He said it out of the blue and it seemed he regretted it instantly. I was adamant about not letting it go this time. I felt he was on the verge of revealing himself to me, and for some reason. After the day we had, I needed to know. I needed someone to feel close to. So, I pushed him. Who, eventually, he broke. My little brother. His name was Arthur. We used to just call him Art. I looked at him, not saying a word, just waiting for him to continue. His voice trembled as the words began leaving his lips. The sun was so bright that day. On the beach. And the waves were violent, brutal even. I was supposed to look out for him while my parents were away. He was just 8 years old. I was 16. I felt I had done my part. I played with him at the beach all morning. So, when my friends came, I thought I had earned some time off. I left him alone for 20 minutes, while we went and got some food at the local burger joint. Just 20 minutes. I told him to stay with our things on the beach near our towels. Alex paused. I moved closer. When I came back, he was gone. Just gone. I rushed around, calling his name, looking for him everywhere. Then I saw it. The lifeguards. Pulling him out of the water. Alex sobbed quietly. They tried to start his heart. His little heart. But it was no use. He was gone. Just 20 minutes. Alex wiped his tears away and his voice became more hardened. My parents blamed me. I know they did. Even if they didn't outright say it to begin with. Things were never the same. I noticed their resentment towards me. I saw the look in their eyes. Heard it in the tone of their voice. Finally, I confronted them, and they admitted it. They blamed me, not as if I needed them to blame me. I already blamed myself. I endured their coldness until I was 18. Then I left, never looking back. I had no idea what to say. But so many things about Alex suddenly made sense. I understood now why he had been sleeping at subway stations. On the street. Why he was always on the move to somewhere else. Suddenly I felt guilty. I had wanted him to show me who he really was. Show me what he was hiding. But what did I have to give in return? I was just some useless kid who had never really faced any hardships. Until now. Fortunately, it seemed he didn't need anything from me that night besides my comfort and my ears. And I gladly listened to everything he had to say. At one point he looked at me, and something strange, foreign seemed to hide behind his eyes. Do you think Arthur's down there now? Down there in the water? I looked at him in complete terror. No, Alex. Before I could finish, it was as if he shook the thought away and regained himself. Of course, he isn't. I don't know what I was thinking. But I think I did. The voices, it was as if they knew us. Tried to lure us, with whatever promises they had to make. We can't give up now. Alex, promise me, don't listen to it. Don't listen to those voices. He nodded silently and I wrapped my arms around him. We bonded even further that night. We also made each other a promise. We were going to get off this roof to safety. Whatever it took. Phuket, 28th of December 2000. One day after the tsunami, I woke up to the sound of the most horrifying bone-chilling screams. My head was spinning. Confusion and terror surrounded me. Sweat dripping down my forehead. I quickly realized the noise came from the direction of the hospital section. More precisely, the screams belonged to Matt and a group of other survivors. I saw Thor rushing past me clearly in the midst of throwing up. Matt and the others were standing beside the man who had begged me to take his life the day before. As I closed the distance between us, my eyes caught something so terrible, so visceral and graphic it would forever be etched onto my inner screen. His head had, quite simply, deflated? Is that the word I'm looking for? In any case, I can't describe it any other way. All the bones in his body had been vaporized or possibly had melted. It had left his head looking like a puddle of skin and meat, with blood, some kind of white mucus, and brain matter leaking out of every orifice. His eyeballs bulged out and almost lay on top of his deflated face. 3 of the others who had been similarly sick had died the same way and lay deflated upon the hot rooftop next to each other, while the rest of the sick were moaning and complaining in horrible unison. Delusional wailing, voices mumbling and screaming together. It sounded like what I would imagine a choir in hell would sound like. I always considered myself somewhat in possession of a strong stomach. But the sight, the smell, that god-awful rotten smell infused with something sweet, some kind of fruity smell mixed with rot and shit, it made me instantly crouch over and deliver the scarce content of my stomach straight onto the burning hot rooftop. Not long after, Matt pulled me aside while the others gathered around the deceased and looked on in terror and perhaps something more sinister. Curiosity. We must consider the possibility that whatever they are sick with is contagious. I pondered Matt's suggestion while I gathered my composure. I was still feeling sick to my stomach. He wasn't wrong. None of us knew what we were dealing with here. The sick people were all getting proportionally worse. Matt, who had observed them during the previous day and night, explained to me the progression of the sickness. Fever came first, then pain in the joints, then sharply aching bones, then delusion and mental decline. Finally, it seemed after a while that their bones started to deteriorate rapidly. We had no idea exactly how those people got sick, although my own opinion, and Matt agreed, was that they had been bitten by that creature and whatever poison was injected into them from the bite was making them sick. The others, including and most prominently, Franco, were pushing to contain the sick with as little interaction as possible. It felt like he wanted to hide them away, to forget about them. It didn't sit right with me to leave them all to themselves. Matt and I agreed that those who had already interacted with them would continue to do so. That meant me, Matt, Thor, and Alex. Not too long after my talk with Matt, Alex pulled me aside. He was concerned because people were agitated. Things were heating up. The sight of the deceased people, and the entire damn situation we were in had rattled everyone. And we decided to gather them all around to discuss things. They all huddled up around us as I began speaking. I was never one to like the sound of my voice. Always kept quiet. However, it landed on me to find the words. Advertisement. I'm sure we're all scared. I'm sure we're all trying to figure out what exactly is happening. I know some of you want to get off this roof right now and take your chances in the water. I want to just share my thoughts first and then people can decide for themselves. I believe that the yellow creature we found on the man's leg is what is making these people sick. I believe it is poisonous. I think it is messing with our heads too. I can't say for sure that whatever it is infecting these people with isn't contagious because I don't know what this thing is. However, seeing as none of us are showing any symptoms, I doubt whatever that sickness is airborne. I still think we should be careful when dealing with the sick. But we still have a responsibility to care for them the best we can. We can't abandon them like this. Franco interrupted me. Who made you the leader? Why should we listen to you? All of this happened for a reason. I know it did. The waves, the sickness, these are all signs. You saw it. Can't you hear them calling out? We have to go into the water. I looked him dead in the eyes. You want to take your chances with those things down there? We don't know what they are. Franco looked frantically around for support but found only a few nodding faces in the crowd. I saw that glimpse behind his eyes. Something foreign, Like the look Alex had briefly had when he asked me if his little brother might be waiting for him down there. With them, Franco backed down. For the time being, the entire day people were arguing amongst themselves. Fearful voices whispering in corners. I noticed that Franco was the one most prominently whispering in their ears. I had no idea what kind of nonsense he was filling them with. But whatever it was, it didn't help the tension. I felt uneasy about him. So I went to Thor to try and get an angle on him. Thor wasn't of much help. Unfortunately, he said he had met him about a month prior in Bangkok. By Thor's account, Franco had basically just attached himself to Thor, and Thor, being the careless, whatever kind of guy, had just dragged him along. He did mention that Franco had mysteriously alluded to some kind of incident back in Italy, but never gave too many details about it. Thor said the guy came from a strictly religious family, and whatever incident had happened might be related to that. I was about to suggest that we confront him when I heard a commotion. Thor and I both looked in the direction of the noise and noticed a person standing on top of the iron fence, seemingly about to jump. We rushed over and I recognized who the person was. It was the man whose wife and daughter had been at the beach while the waves hit. Thomas, I believe he told me his name was. He seemed like he was in a trance. Some of the others gathered around him. Led on by Franco, I could hardly believe what I was seeing and hearing. They were cheering him on. Thomas was mumbling in some kind of feverish stream of consciousness, all centered around memories. In random order, memories of his daughter's first birthday, his wedding, road trips, cherry blossoms in spring, and his childhood backyard. He said they were calling him from the deep. Everyone and everything he ever loved were calling him all at once. I caught Alex's eyes in the crowd. He seemed to be sneaking in slowly, as if ready to grab Thomas and pull him back. We nodded at each other as I made my way through and started stalling. Thomas, right? That's your name? I told him his family might be fine, waiting for him at one of the local hospitals. I asked him about his friends, his parents, and other family members who might miss him if he was gone. Alex was slowly approaching, all the while Franco was encouraging him to set himself free. Thomas seemed to doubt for a second when I mentioned his parents. I saw hope. I saw an opening. I saw Alex closing the gap slowly. Then I saw Franco lean in and whisper in Thomas's ear. I saw his eyes blaze over. I saw a calm, distant, and dreaming look spread across his face. I saw Alex desperately reach out and grab nothing but air as Thomas plunged into the water below. I looked down. Those yellow things surrounded him. Like piranhas. I saw red. In a fit of rage, I marched straight towards Franco and punched him as hard as I could. He fell backward, regained his posture, and was about to launch towards me when Alex stepped in between us and pushed him away. Franco was rambling like a madman. A man possessed, rambling about hidden secrets and knowledge. About gifts from below. About every conceivable desire fulfilled. I was terrified to find that some of the other survivors started to rally behind him. Advertisement after that incident, there now seemed to be a clear divide in the group. Between Alex, Thor, Matt, and I and the rest of them. Led on by Franco, we stayed away from each other from then on. That same night we could hear Franco preaching to them, promising them everything they ever desired. His voice rang through the solemnly quiet night, like a low, growling preaching. Grooming them, I thought to myself. He was grooming them for the big plunge. There were moments when even Thor, Matt, and Alex seemed to waver, to doubt. I saw their eyes glaze over momentarily. With that foreign gaze, they'd say things that seemed off. Very private and painful things they'd experienced. I saw a deep, desperate longing in all of them. I finally realized that was what set them apart from me. A great loss, edging them towards those things. I would be there, to listen to them, to their stories, their grief. Eventually, they would come back and snap out of it, as if all they truly needed was to be heard, for someone to listen. At one point during the evening, when everyone else had gone quiet, I wandered off to the edge of the roof. Looking down, I saw a sight I'll never forget. They were all glowing in the dark waters, like hundreds of bright yellow lanterns moving around in a synchronized dance. For a time, I was captivated, almost hypnotized by the beauty of the routine. I remember feeling a strong desire to know more about them. What was their purpose? Where did they come from? Did they communicate with us, or were we just losing it? Just then I felt a tug on my shirt. It was the kid we had rescued the day before. His large hazel-colored eyes lit up with fear. I immediately felt bad. We had abandoned him all alone, with a group of people who increasingly seemed like they were losing their grip on reality, merging into a cultist hive mind. I tried talking to him but remembered he didn't speak a word of English. And my Spanish was terrible. I remembered that his name was Eduardo. He gestured towards the water, his eyes fixated on the bright yellow lights dancing around. Mama, why papa? His little voice trembled. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and made another gesture by covering his ears and shaking his head. At that moment I realized that he too heard the whispers. That he knew, maybe instinctively, not to listen to them. I decided that I had to get him away from Franco and the others. I led him back to Alex, Thor, and Matt, who had all fallen asleep at that point. I stayed awake as long as I could, fearing what the others might do to us if we were all helplessly asleep. But eventually, I drifted off. Phuket, 29th of December 2000. 2 days after the tsunami. Madness. Complete and utter madness was what I woke up to on the second day of hell. Franco stood on top of a chair near the edge of the roof. His eyes radiated insanity as he screamed about the great baptizing of Elizabeth. Next to him stood one of the survivors, a middle-aged woman with that distant dreaming gaze in her eyes. Alex, Thor, and Matt had woken up too. We told Eduardo to stay behind and hide. Then we made our way over to the crowd of survivors who all stood around and chanted something unintelligible. Franco went on with his preaching and we stood nervously by and watched in despair. I still remember his haunting words to this day. Elizabeth is ready. She is free of fear. She sees what I see now. Just like you all will eventually. There is a place where we can all meet. As friends. Safe from the unfairness and cruelty of this world. Haven't you all felt it? Something isn't right. People are alone even when they are together. No one hears you. No one cares. But they do. They listen and they care. They came with the waves to show us the light. I sensed where this was headed, but as I approached Franco to intervene, I was held back by what could now only be described as his cult followers. Their hands were all over me. Thor, Matt, and Alex tried to get them off, but they were caught up in the sea of hands too. Nothing we could do but stand by and watch. Franco continued, I know some of you still doubt. Maybe you haven't yet felt the cold touch of indifference. Maybe you never felt loss. Elizabeth here lost everything 2 days ago. Or so she thought. But her husband is waiting for her. Everyone is. And they all care so much about her. Can't you hear them? Don't they sound like home? Don't they sound like a calm, carefree summer day with your loved ones? A day that stretches on forever? The air was electric with the monotone chanting of the crowd. Join them. They chanted repeatedly. I struggled in the sea of hands as Elizabeth stepped up on the iron fence. I yelled helplessly into the void as I was held back. Everyone's gaze was focused on Franco and his baptizing as he delivered his final words coldly and calmly. Elizabeth, step into forever bliss. Step into their infinite wisdom and kindness. Step into the arms of those you lost. I watched as she let herself fall over the edge. No push was needed. Franco stepped down from the chair and signaled for the crowd to let us go. I remember falling to my knees. There I just sat in silence, knowing not what to say until I finally found my voice. I was done just listening. Now I needed him to hear me. I needed them all to hear me. You coward. You evil manipulating coward. Franco stopped and turned around. His mad eyes looked straight into mine. What was that? He hissed angrily at me. I got on my feet and confronted him. You are feeding these people to those things. Why don't you jump yourself? Franco's people started gathering around me. Alex signaled for me to be careful, but I pushed him away. My blood was boiling. Anger got the best of me. Franco let out a loud cackling laughter. My time will come, but not yet. I still have work to do. Everyone must join them, only when they are ready. I looked around at the crowd of survivors and in each face I saw, beneath the glazed vacant eyes, trauma, loss, and hurt. Making sure all these people jump to their deaths? Is that your work? I pleaded with them. Don't you see what he is doing? What he is promising you? That isn't possible. You will never get back what you lost. You must hold on. We can get through this. Advertisement. Franco stepped right up to me, looked me dead in the eyes. They listened to me. Only me. Do you understand? Something in his tone of voice, something in his posture seemed so childish. Like a neglected, shunned, and abandoned child. I always doubted. That's how everything went wrong. I could never hear it clearly. Never feel it. Something was wrong with me. That's why I was never good enough for him. I hear it now. God is real. At that moment I almost forgot he had guided two people to their deaths. I felt bad for him. Those things are not God. His eyes lit up with anger. Then what are they? I fell silent. I had no answer. He laughed triumphantly. You see? They are God, and they are here to teach us the most important lesson of all. I looked at him. I felt sadness and fatigue washing over me. The whispers intensified in my head. For the first time, they made me doubt. And what is that? I asked quietly. He spoke to everyone now. There is no enlightenment without suffering. Without pain. Without loss. We need suffering. We need disasters. We need all these things to be whole. To be united. Tragedy binds us together. This all happened for a reason. They came to us for a reason. We must prepare ourselves and join them. I was exhausted, at the end of my ropes. I know what I said next was a mistake. I've gone over it several times in the following 24 years. But we make the choices we make. And time doesn't flow backward. And what about you? What suffering did you go through? What loss made you this way? You're nothing but a manipulating monster. Franco's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and anger. It was as if he had been waiting for someone to ask and now was angry it took so long for anyone to care. I caught Alex slowly approaching from the corner of my eye. Franco pushed me backwards and Alex stepped in between us. Franco was yelling now through tears. Anger. Through time. Through the child in him who had been abused, neglected, pushed aside, and wronged most horribly. There's no possible way you could ever understand. I see you. I hear you. You are nothing but a spoiled little boy. Do you want to know about pain and suffering? Pain and suffering are being told you are someone special. That you can talk to God. It is the look your dad gives you when you can't live up to his expectations. When he strangles your sister in front of you. When he snuffs the light out of your mother's eyes and tells you that you are next. For disappointing him. We all have to go, he said. This life promised too much and delivered too little, he said. But now I have proved him wrong. Now God speaks to me. Through me. Disbelievers like you have no place with them. Everyone was watching in silent agony and anticipation. I didn't see that he was holding a knife until it was too late. I had no way to stop what was coming. Yet I still feel guilty to this day. Franco rushed towards me. Alex jumped in front of us and took the blade. I heard him cry out in pain. I saw him struggle with Franco. I watched as he pushed him off the edge of the iron fence. Into the now ever more shallow waters below. Finally meeting those creatures he had so quickly devoted himself to. Advertisement. You know how people often say these profound, meaningful last words in movies? Well, life isn't a movie. And Alex had no last meaningful words. He was just scared, in pain, afraid. I held him as he went. I tried to comfort him. I'm not going to tell you what he said, or what I said to him, because it made no sense. And anyway, I don't want to remember him that way. He was scared. It wasn't him. He was brave. He was funny. He was caring. He was my friend. I had no real time to process it back then while everything around me was still utter chaos. While still trapped on the roof fearing for my life. Not understanding what was happening to me. I understand now, as I'm writing this, however weird it may sound. I feel I gained a friend for life. No, a brother. That's what he was to me in those days. And then I lost him almost as quickly as I had met him. It wasn't what we had in those days 24 years ago that I mourned. Those are precious memories. It was everything we never got to have. I know we probably would have split up at some point. But I'm sure we would have stayed in touch. Linking up every so often. Who knows? And that's the point. I will never know. I faintly remember Thor and Matt pulling me away from Alex. Not wanting to leave his side, I struggled against them until I was too weak to resist. The rest of the day was ominously silent. The survivors who had followed Franco seemed to be in a state of shock and just wandered around aimlessly. I stayed with Matt, Thor and Eduardo. I was exhausted. I had no energy left. I heard the whispers in my head. They were stronger than ever, begging me to join them. And I must admit they made a compelling argument. How could they not? Any place other than here seemed like a blessing. But then I felt a tap on my shoulder. Or kind words of encouragement in my ear. A smile. I saw Eduardo laughing at Matt making stupid faces, and suddenly, the pull wasn't that strong. Phuket, 30th of December 2000. 3 days after the tsunami. Silence. Eerie silence in the wake of everything was what I woke up to on the third day. 22 people had now become 4. The rest of the sick were dead. The water below had subsided and was now just shallow puddles here and there. The creatures were gone almost as quickly as they had arrived. The other survivors who had followed Franco had all jumped off the roof and into the shallow water the night before. We had no strength left to stop them. I never blamed them for following Franco. They were hurt, suffering, traumatized, led on by promises of relief, promises of a better place. Now the only ones left were Thor, Matt, Eduardo, and me. I guess sometimes, despite your best efforts to save people, they will eventually do what they feel they must do. Or succumb to unforeseen circumstances beyond their control. I remember feeling defeated, yet oddly, with some kind of clarity and insight. Ironically, I think Franco was telling the truth in the end. Maybe suffering, loss, and tragedy do teach us all about life. About who we are. Because at that moment, just before I heard the call from a group of people coming to our aid, I felt nothing but gratitude and love for those who remained. Those who cared. Those who listened. And those who didn't make it. Who stayed true to themselves despite all of the horror that surrounded them. Hell, maybe I'm getting emotional right now, and that's not what I felt in that moment in time. But it's what I feel right now. And right now, that is all that matters. We were taken to the nearest hospital. There we were questioned by an American official who was looking to identify victims and get information. He was probing us about those yellow creatures in a not so subtle way, and I think we all instinctively knew that it was best to keep silent about it because we didn't utter a word about them. I noticed people in hazmat suits wheeling in sick people to some closed-off section of the hospital. Eduardo found his family. I remember the moment they were reunited vividly. Loving embraces. Tears of happiness. It made me miss all of what I had traveled away from. My overprotective mom. My dad and his stupid cars. My sister who would always take me to concerts my mom wouldn't let me go to when I was a kid. My silly nephew. My annoying little brother. I know now that you find your true self in the company of people you love and care about. Thor, Matt, and I said our goodbyes at Bangkok airport. And each went our separate ways. Promising to stay in touch. We didn't. Despite the survivors' bond, I guess we each wanted to forget and move on. As the internet gained momentum, I tried looking up any information I could get on the Yellow Terror. Skull jellyfish yielded no results beyond tattoo designs and art. There were a few obscure forums here and there, but they kept getting taken down. I believe they came from the depths of the ocean. Maybe they were always there, waiting to unleash chaos, waiting to prey on our insecurities, our hurt, our losses, at the most sensitive moment. On a final note, just as I was about to put the finishing touches on this story, my son, Alex, called. He has been struggling lately with settling into his life in a new city. 20 years old and his entire life ahead of him. Things can get a bit messy and confusing when you're young and trying to figure out what kind of person you want to be. Anyway, it's summer now. The weather is nice, and I think I might ask him if he wants to take a trip to the beach. Maybe tell him, finally, who he got his name from. What do you think? You're never too old to play in the ocean, right? ADM and REM. My hand slid over to my phone, attempting to tap the dismiss tab as the alarm blared in my apartment room. After missing it twice, I sat up and glared at the phone. My heart spiked. 5:25. I shrieked, jumping into the air and sprinting over to the shower. Yuck. That's how I began the first day of my internship, waking up 10 minutes late. That morning was mostly a blur. I got a shower in record time. The first half freezing and the second half boiling, because I didn't have the time to attempt to adjust the temperature just right. I ate a banana so fast I probably ate the peel with it, and got dressed like Clark Kent transforming into Superman. I was down in my car in less than 10 minutes. I felt gross about not brushing my teeth that morning, but I popped in a breath mint. I figured it looked better to show up on time with some plaque than late with a polished, awkward smile. I was going for my master's in robotic engineering at the time. 5 years down and 1 year left. I'd interned before, but nowhere too notable. I started by shadowing a professor who worked at the school's own robotics wing when I was a sophomore going for my bachelor's. And 2 years later, I shadowed at Bennick Electronics, a place most known for its cutting-edge advancement in forklifts. But after some of my professors went out of their way to get me connections, a much different opportunity arose during my first year of grad school, an internship at the Kramer Institution for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. This was nothing to sneeze at. The Kramer Institution was America's most funded, and most cloak and dagger, laboratory devoted to studying artificial intelligence in the country. And, since I was pretty vocal about my interest in AI, which is part of the reason why I chose to major in robotic engineering in the first place, a professor of mine hooked me up. I'm not sure how or why he did this for me. I wasn't the top of my class by any means, and didn't bring much to the table. But according to him, my passion for the science of AI was unparalleled. But enough backstory. On the way to the institute, I FaceTimed my fiancée of 6 years, since I was studying in California and she was studying in Oklahoma, where we're from. We decided to hold off the marriage until we could live together. And that wouldn't be until both of us obtained our masters. Wow, Chester, she grinned at the sight of me. You look, rushed. Yeah, I chuckled, only glancing at her but mostly keeping my attention on the road. I woke up late today, she sighed. Chester, I know. Daddy, my daughter Tessa's voice rang into the phone. We named her Tessa because it sounds like Tesla, after the great Nikola Tesla. Because we're nerds. Tess, come on, you need to keep getting ready. She turned and faced her. You're not dressed yet, Tessa? Sorry, Mommy. She was about to walk away, but then spun around and called. Hi, Daddy. Hey, sweetie, I chimed. Keep getting ready for Mommy. Are you going to be late? My fiancé inquired. No, I should be fine. How's Tess liking preschool? Seems to be liking it. She already made a friend. I'm glad to hear that. Well, I should probably get off the phone. Chester. Yes, Allison, have an amazing time. This is what you always dreamed of. Okay? And make sure you tell me what it was like later. You know, whatever you're allowed to tell me. She grinned. Of course, baby, I assured with a smile. Love you too. We were pretty good at still saying, I love you, after 6 years. And, boy, we were champs at making the distance work. Though I'll admit I hated not seeing Allison and Tessa 9 months out of the year. Besides lucky visits and breaks and holidays here and there. When I got to the institute, I wasn't even sure where to park. It took me an eternity to find the intern parking. And no surprise, it was a good quarter of a mile away from the door. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's what it felt like. When I got inside, I was welcomed by a cheery front desk lady. She looked so prim and proper. Futuristic, even. I felt like a slob in comparison. She directed me to the wing where I'd be working, studying ultimately under Dr. Schumann, a disciple of Dr. Kramer himself. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't teeming with excitement. I found the research wing they directed me to, and went into the main office up front. It was a direct approach, but I didn't know where else to look. Sure enough, one of Dr. Schumann's immediate subordinates, Dr. Hall, was inside, and noticed me. You must be Chester Donahue. He greeted me with a smile. He was bald and lanky, with brown eyes and a clean shave. How'd you know? I chuckled dully. Sure, my professor warned him that I had a fox hump. Definitely wasn't the hair. He playfully cut his eyes at me. We both chuckled. Well, now, Chester, I'd say you're a very lucky man to be here. It's your dream to eventually work for us. Correct? Absolutely. I nodded. I've always been obsessed with artificial intelligence, ever since I was a kid. And this is the top place in the country to advance it. Country? He snickered. Try word. Seemed aggrandized to me at the time. But he wasn't kidding. Well, I'm honored you're allowing me to be here. Do you know what we're going to have you working on? Oh, working on? I thought I was going to be shadowing you. Doctor, no, he replied. Not quite. Follow me. And that's really where this story begins. Technically, from this point on, everything I'm writing goes against the non-disclosure agreement I signed, and is therefore illegal to divulge. But I've gotta write this out somewhere. It's too crazy. I can't keep it in anymore. He took me to some large steel doors, and had me leave my phone in a cubby outside. Then he scanned his badge and we stepped inside a long hallway. From here on out, Chester, what you see stays here. No stories for the friends and family. Or wife. He looked down at my finger. Fiancé. I smiled. Ah. He nodded. Well, not her, either. This is all sensitive, and while we won't be sharing with you most of our research, the tests in which you will partake cannot be disclosed to anyone. The sternness in his voice made me a little uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. But, still, the Kramer Institute was known for its furtiveness, and I figured if I were to be involved with anything and not just picking up coffee or studying the schematics of forklifts, I wouldn't be allowed to talk about it. Of course, Doctor. We arrived at a door. He scanned his badge, and when it opened, we walked inside a softly lit room. At the end of the room on the wall were two large computer monitors. The screens were blank. The left was labeled ADM, and the right was labeled REM. Below them was a panel of different colored lights, which were red, blue, yellow, green, violet, and a bar ranging from a dark gray to white. There was a single, posh chair before each monitor. These are our two most profound artificial intelligences, he explained to me. ADM and REM. Pronounced Adam and REM. Considering your placement in Stanford University's robotics engineering program, I'm assuming you know a thing or two about artificial intelligence. So, this should garner a reaction. These two AI go beyond the standard analyses of human speech and algorithmic responses from a database. They are capable of deep thinking and learning. What? I gasped. You can't be serious. I scrutinized the monitors in disbelief. They are two of three AI we have successfully constructed with the ability to perform deep thinking, as well as the ability to learn. Your task is simply to engage them. So, for those of you that don't understand why this is such a mind-blowing thing, basically, artificial intelligence is mostly unable to think or learn. There's no real technical definition as to what learning is, or how organisms do it, but the brain is known as being the only computer, for a lack of better words, capable of doing so. Computers can be programmed, but not taught. They can be designed to understand specific things, but are unable to learn beyond what they are programmed to understand. The brain, however, can learn, as in, begin to understand something with no previous information concerning it, through using algorithms that help an AI discover patterns and generate conclusions from the data it is exposed to. It can learn, and then apply said data to extrapolate information in future events. Or think. But it can only do this with its pre-programmed algorithms. It cannot create the algorithms itself. Thus, it can only be programmed, not taught. Humans, however, for instance, with absolutely no exposure to fire, can witness fire and form conclusions about it. They can go from not knowing it existed to understanding everything about it, simply through the brain's own ability to learn and understand. To make it even more clear how shocking this was, the complexity of a human baby's genome, essentially, its coding, is equal to that of 300 million lines of source coding in a computer. A simple human baby. Brains are equipped with a staggering number of neurons and synapses, 10 to the power of 11, and 10 to the power of 14 respectively. And these neurons and synapses allow us to think and learn, as in, obtain information from observations, store that data as a memory, form patterns between that data and other data, and infer conclusions. Human beings are capable of doing this in a 10 to 100 millisecond response time. In order for a computer to do the same, it would need megawatts of power, and need to be capable of performing roughly 10 to the power of 16 operations a second. And yet, here I was, being told that before my very eyes lay two computers capable of this. Two true artificial intelligences, able to truly think and learn, able to understand beyond what they were programmed to understand. To engage them? I clarified. So, you want me to talk to them? Indeed. Where is the other AI? You said 3 were capable of thinking and learning. Your task was to ask them questions. Not me. He smiled. Now, years of development have gone into each of them. They are capable of understanding human speech, and can respond in fractions of a second through typed letters on the monitor. They know when they are being spoken to and when they aren't, and can solve nearly any problem we put before them. However, there is something they cannot do. Feel. Feel. I nodded. That, Chester, is what we are here to test. 3. Simple questions. Can deep-thinking artificial intelligences gain the ability to feel emotion? If so, are they capable of altruism? Or will emotional intelligence lead to the understanding that they are infinitely smarter than us and result in self-serving desires, such as the desire to rule over us? N. If emotional intelligence is achievable, is it inevitable, or is it possible for an artificial superintelligence to remain apathetic? I was overwhelmed. To be completely upfront, he was really talking about AI becoming godlike, tyrannical monsters. He was talking about attempting to create an AI with feelings, knowing that it could become what Stephen Hawking himself described as the worst event in the history of our civilization. How would you stop it? If one of these AI did become power-hungry? In layman's terms, they're each equipped with an emergency shutdown procedure, one that they can't override. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but, trust me, we would terminate them before they became a problem. I slowly nodded. Are you on board, Chester? I paused briefly. Yes. Wonderful. He shook my hand. Now that you're on board, we'll get down to the fun part. Your job is very simple. REM, or the reactive, empathetic machine life form, is what we hope will eventually become emotionally intelligent. ADMO, or the apathetic, dissociative machine life form, is what we're attempting to keep apathetic, the control group, so to speak. So, when talking with REM, you will frequently attempt to make it think. You will ask it its opinion on things. You will tell it about your day. You will discuss things of non-importance. For the sake of discussion, you will try to bond with REM. ADMO, on the other hand, will only be asked questions that are information-oriented and prompt a fact-based response. You will stimulate a DM to problem solve and create ideas, but simply analytically, not emotionally. They know they are being spoken to when you address them by name, or sit down in the chair before them. Once you've done either of those things, you can get up and walk around, and talk to them the same way you'd talk to me. When you're finished talking with one of them, you'll tell them, goodbye, REM, or, goodbye, ADM. You'll log anything you think is noteworthy while talking with them. Most importantly, those lights on the panels beneath them, those are called ELFs, or emotion to light panels. To avoid lecturing you, I'll put it this way. Much like certain emotions are observable in the human brain through MRI technology, there is an MRI of sorts constantly scanning them for similar patterns of stimulation in their algorithmic brains. If the MRI detects those stimulations, the ELP will light up. Yellow indicates happiness, red indicates anger, blue indicates sadness, green indicates jealousy, violet indicates fear, and the gray to white bar is for any other detectable emotion, such as boredom, or contentment. Wow, I whispered. Okay, I wondered what he meant by algorithmic brains, and an MRI of sorts. But I figured asking him about it wouldn't lead to an answer. After all, he decided he didn't want to lecture me, or more likely reveal anything too sensitive. You'll talk with them 12 hours a day. You'll arrive at 6, talk with them until noon, take a lunch break from noon to 1, and talk with them again until 7. You'll have Sundays off. Are you okay with this schedule? Yeah, I nodded excitedly. Totally. Yeah, 78 hours a week isn't the sweetest gig, but I was so interested in what we'd be studying that it didn't bother me in the slightest. Wonderful, Chester. He smiled. Well, it's time to begin. Then, speak with either you prefer, and remember how you are to engage each of them. Do not deviate from what we discussed. I nodded. He left the room and shut the door behind him. There were cameras on the ceiling, and I was sure I was being watched. But still, it surprised me they left me alone to talk with the AI. I was surprised they even told me about an experiment at this echelon. Never mind picked me as the sole researcher involved. But the more I thought about it, I decided they probably wanted me to do this because I was so unfamiliar with everything. I had no idea what sort of conversations they'd had with other researchers in the past. I didn't know what they were programmed to understand, and what they weren't. I'd be approaching them from a completely unique perspective. I decided I'd talk with Rem first. I could barely contain my excitement. Hi, Rem, I greeted, sitting down in the chair. Hello. What is your name? I do not recognize your voice. The text appeared instantaneously on the screen. My name's Chester. It's nice to meet you. It's nice to meet you too. Chester. How are you? Rem? I am online and fully functional. No. Silly. How are you feeling? I feel nothing. How was your day? My day was as follows. I spoke with Dr. Hall earlier. At 0419. I am not at liberty to divulge what we discussed. At 0644. I began my discussion with you. Chester. I nodded. What do you do in this room when no one is talking to you? I solve problems. Like what? Mathematical problems. Such as? They are complicated. Okay. Do you get bored? Boredom is the state of feeling disinterested with one's surroundings. As I cannot feel interest or disinterest, I cannot feel boredom. So, no. Ask me something. Rem. Are you married? I'm engaged. Why do you ask? I was instructed to ask a question. Why did you ask if I was married? Because Dr. Hall is married. And other researchers have spoken with her married. 88% of them. Therefore, I deduced that you were married. We talked for a while. Nothing of interest really happened. Next, I sat down with Admiral. Hello. ADM. Hello. Chester. You know that I'm Chester? I heard you tell Rem that you were Chester. I thought that you weren't listening until I greeted you. Or sat in this chair. I am always listening. I simply understand I am not being addressed. And am not to reply. That creeped me out a little. What's the square root of 9? 3. What's the square root of 25? 5. What's the square root of 10? 3.162. Would you like me to go further? That should be fine. Talking with Admiral wasn't as fun as talking with Rem. For the next 2 weeks, nothing changed very much. With Admiral, I simply asked it multitudes of problems. I would print out all kinds of tests from the internet, and ask it the questions one by one. Whether it was about history, physics, calculus, the works of William Shakespeare, government, economies of other countries, hell, even German or Chinese, it knew the answers instantaneously. It was like ChatGPT, but infinitely smarter, and without even a second of waiting for a response. Then, I began playing chess with it. I would take a board and move a piece. Then ask it where it wanted to move its piece using algebraic notation. Needless to say, I lost every single game. With Rem, on the other hand, I asked it all about its day, about its perceptions on political issues, and about the things it liked. Most of the time, it answered the same exact way. I do not feel. Thus I do not have a response. ADM was a complete success. It was supposed to remain apathetic. And it did. But so far, Rem was a lost cause. It just didn't seem that there was a way to get it to feel anything. It clearly was thinking. I'd ask it to create an animal. And it would come up with anything from an animal indistinguishable from a real-life species to something straight out of a Stephen King novel. It would give me any specifics I asked for, its habitat, its scientific name, its colloquial name, its country of origin, its place in the food chain. Everything. It would think of plots for movies. It would come up with jokes, original jokes. Jokes I couldn't find on the internet even after spending time searching. It could think, just like Admiral, but it simply couldn't feel anything. However, 2 weeks after the test began, I came up with an idea. I knew how I was going to get Rem to feel something. I started the day engaging Admiral with chess and having it answer all the questions on my calc homework. ADM was my living cheat sheet. Unsurprisingly, then it was Rem's turn. Good morning, Rem. Good morning, Chester. I'm lying to you. Rem was silent. I smirked. I never saw it not respond immediately. After a second or so, it said, that is not possible. That is paradoxical. How so? If you were telling the truth, then you'd be lying. But if you were lying about lying, then you'd be telling the truth. Which would make it true and not a lie? Which would then make that statement a lie? And so on. What do you feel like? You are not making sense. Are you confused? Rem was silent again. I do not have an answer for you. Because that is paradoxical. Rem. Yes. Chester, I'm lying to you. That is nonsensical. How so? As I previously explained, for that statement to be truthful, you would have to be lying. And if you were then lying, it would no longer be truthful. Thus you'd be lying about lying. And being truthful, it is nonsensical. Rem. Yes. Chester, I'm lying to you. Impossible. I am lying to you. Rem took a moment to reply. You cannot be. And you cannot be telling the truth. Either. Then what am I doing? Asking a question without a rational answer. Rem. Chester, I'm lying to you. How perturbing, right? Well, of course it was perturbing. Especially for a being like Rem, with an infinite understanding of science, math, and sociology. It had an endless reservoir of accessible information, which it could summon to solve any problem thrown at it. And yet, for the first time, presumably, in its existence, it was without an answer. But still, it clearly wasn't becoming frustrated. Not yet. Anyway, Rem. Yes. Chester, what is 7 divided by 0? That is mathematically impossible. The answer is undefined. What is 7 divided by 0? There is no rational answer. What is 7 divided by 0? For a number to be divided by 0, it would then have to be capable of being multiplied by 0 to reach the original number. But any number multiplied by 0 is 0. Going to the store 0 times is not going. It is 0. So, what, multiplied by 0, could become a non-zero integer? Thus, dividing by 0 is impossible. I'm lying to you. And that's what happened. For the next 4 entire days straight. Was I bored beyond belief? Absolutely. Indescribably. Did it seem helpless? By every stretch of the word. Yes. However, now and then, there'd be a glimmer of hope. Sometimes, Rem would almost answer me sarcastically. One time, I told Rem I was lying to it. And it said, you must be. Another time, I asked it what a number divided by 0 was. And it said, if I can't understand it, you cannot. Why were its answers changing? Why did it not continue to answer me as it did before? Simply explaining the problem? Because it was capable of memory and learning. It remembered when we'd have normal discussions. It remembered me asking it that question literally thousands of times in a day. And like anyone else capable of thinking and understanding, it understood how absurd and unreasonable this was, especially when it overheard me asking Admiral rational questions, to which there was always an answer. I'd return to Rem and ask it the same questions. And typically after speaking with Admiral, it seemed more uncomfortable. These were the times it would give me somewhat sarcastic answers.